Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Nightmare Narratives. I can picture some of you already in bed, maybe some of you just getting home from work. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I'm glad you're here. If this helps you relax or sleep, please like and subscribe. It means a lot. Now let's get you comfortable, and I'll tell you tonight's story. My name is Samuel Hartwell, and I've been a ranger in these West Virginia mountains for 18 years. That's long enough to know every trail, every ridge, and every hidden valley in the Monongahela National Forest. Long enough to hear all the old stories, too. The mountain folk around here talk about things that walk the high places after dark. They call them haints, spirits of folks who died bad deaths and never found their way to whatever comes next. Used to be, I'd just nod politely when some old-timer would warn me about the Devil's Backbone Trail or tell me to avoid Dolly Sods when the fog rolls in. Mountain haints were just old folks' tales until I walked the Devil's Backbone Trail in October of '76. That's when I learned the dead don't always stay buried, especially when they got unfinished business. I grew up in these mountains. My great-great-grandfather fought at Rich Mountain in 1861, one of the first battles of the Civil War. Lost his brother there. My daddy died when I was 12. Mine collapsed over in Tucker County. Mama always said the mountains take what they want when they want it. I thought she was just being dramatic. The Dolly Sods wilderness is special, even by mountain standards. It sits up high, over 4,000 feet, where the air gets thin and the weather turns mean without warning. The whole plateau is covered in ancient bog, older than the pyramids. Rocky outcrops jut up like broken teeth, and the rhododendron thickets grow so thick you can't see 3 feet into them. In October, when the leaves turn and the first snow dusts the peaks, Dolly Sods becomes something else entirely. The silence gets so deep it makes your ears hurt. Fog banks roll up from the valleys below and swallow everything. You can be standing in bright sunshine 1 minute and lost in a gray world the next. I should have known something was wrong when the university folks went missing. Professor Sarah Chen and her archaeology team had been working the Rich Mountain site for 2 weeks, digging up what they thought was a Civil War campsite. They had all the right permits, good equipment, and plenty of experience. Dr. Chen had excavated battlefields from Gettysburg to Antietam. I'd checked on them 3 days before they vanished. Everything looked normal. Careful grid work, labeled bags of artifacts, detailed notes. Chen was excited about what they'd found. Musket balls, uniform buttons, pieces of a regimental flag. Nothing unusual for a Civil War site. Then they stopped checking in. Standard protocol for missing persons in the wilderness is simple. Contact the state police, organize a grid search, bring in search and rescue teams. I'd done it dozens of times over the years. Lost hikers, injured climbers, the occasional hunter who wandered too far from his truck. Usually found them within 24 hours. Cold and scared but alive. This time felt different from the start. When I reached the the site on October 15th, the silence hit me like a wall. Not normal quiet, normal. This was the kind of silence that happens when every living thing has run away from something it can't see but knows is there. No birds, no insects. Even the wind had died. The dig site looked like the team had just stepped away for lunch. Shovels leaned against trees, brushes laid beside half-exposed artifacts, notebooks open to half-finished sketches. But there was something wrong with the arrangement. The tools weren't scattered randomly like people had dropped them in a hurry. They were lined up, organized, like soldiers' equipment laid out for inspection. I called out their names. Dr. Chen, Mike, Jennifer. My voice echoed off the rocks and died. No answer. I tried my radio, but all I got was static with something underneath it that sounded almost like Morse code. Dots and dashes in a pattern I didn't recognize. The temperature gauge on my belt read 42 degrees. Should have been at least 55 for that time of day. My breath came out in little puffs, and frost sparkled on the grass in places where the sun should have warmed it away hours ago. I started following the search grid I'd planned, calling out every few minutes, listening for any response. That's when I found the first impossible thing. Scattered along the main trail were objects that shouldn't exist. A brass button with an eagle design, green with age. A piece of leather that looked like it came from a cartridge box. A bent pewter spoon. All of them were lying on top of fresh leaves, like they'd been dropped the night before. But Chen's team had been finding these same types of artifacts buried 3 feet down in the soil. My compass started acting up around noon. Instead of pointing north, the needle swung toward the dig site and stayed there, quivering like it was scared. I tapped the glass, shook it, even held it away from my belt buckle and radio in case they were causing interference. Nothing helped. That's when I heard the drums. At first, I thought it was someone playing music in the distance, a steady rhythm, like a marching beat. But as I listened, it got clearer. These weren't modern drums. They had a hollow, wooden sound, the kind you hear in old war movies, and they were coming from the direction of the dig site. I followed the sound back through the trees, my skin crawling. The drum beat stayed steady, never getting louder or softer, like it was always the same distance away, no matter which direction I walked. When I reached the clearing, the drums stopped. The dig site had changed. The careful excavation work Chen's team had been doing was gone. Instead, the earth was churned up like someone had been digging frantically with their bare hands. Clods of dirt were scattered everywhere, and in the center of the mess was a hole. Not the neat, square excavation units the archaeologists had dug. This was rough, deep, and shaped wrong, shaped like a grave. I pulled out my flashlight and shined it down into the hole. The beam couldn't reach the bottom, but I could see something pale about 6 feet down. Cloth, maybe. Old cloth. That's when my radio crackled to life. Ranger Station 47, this is base. Come in, Sam. I grabbed for the handset, grateful to hear a human voice. Base, this is Sam. I'm at the archaeological site. The university team is missing, and I've got some unusual conditions up here. Static filled the line for a long moment. Then, Sam, this is Jake. I'm getting reports of drums from your sector. Military drums. You hearing anything? Jake Morrison was the ranger for the adjacent district. Good man, 20 years in the service, not prone to imagination. Yeah, I heard them too. But Jake, there's something else. This dig site. It looks like someone's been digging graves up here. Deep ones. More static. When Jake's voice came back, it sounded different. Worried. Sam, I just talked to old Pete Hawkins down in the valley. He says his dogs won't go up the mountain. Been howling all night, trying to hide under his porch. And Sam, he says he can smell smoke. Wood smoke, like from a campfire. But there ain't supposed to be any fires up there. I looked around the clearing. No smoke. But now that Jake mentioned it, I could smell something. Faint, but definitely there. Wood smoke, and something else underneath it. Something sweet and sick that made my stomach turn. Jake, I'm going to keep searching for the team, but I want you to call the state police and get a full search and rescue operation started. Something's not right up here. Copy that. Sam, be careful. Pete says the old-timers are talking about the mountain being angry. Says the dead don't rest easy when their graves get disturbed. I clicked off the radio and stared down into that impossible hole. The pale cloth at the bottom looked more defined now, like my eyes were adjusting to the depth. It was a uniform, gray wool with brass buttons, a Confederate uniform, and it was moving. I stumbled backward from the hole, my heart hammering against my ribs. The cloth had definitely moved, not like wind was blowing it, but like something was wearing it, something that was trying to sit up. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for my camera. I needed evidence. Proof that this was really happening. But when I looked through the viewfinder, the hole was empty. Just dark earth and shadows. I lowered the camera. The uniform was back. That's when I heard the voice. You there, boy? You wearing federal blue? The voice came from the hole, thin and scratchy, like old paper. I should have run. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get out of there. But something kept me frozen in place, staring down at that pale shape in the darkness. I'm a park ranger, I said, feeling ridiculous for talking to what had to be my imagination. I'm looking for some missing people. Park ranger? A dry chuckle echoed up from the grave. Ain't no parks here, boy. This here's Virginia. Confederate Virginia. You got any water? Been powerful thirsty down here. This is West Virginia, I said. And it's 1976. Silence from the hole. Then, West Virginia? They ain't no such place, and you're addled if you think it's any year past 1861. I backed away from the grave, my legs feeling like rubber. This wasn't happening. Stress, maybe. Too many hours in the wilderness. Too much worry about the missing team. I was talking to myself and projecting my voice. But as I turned to leave, I saw them. Figures moving between the trees. At first, just shadows, but as my eyes focused, they became more solid. Men in gray uniforms. Some with bandages around their heads or arms. They walked in formation, their boots making no sound on the leaf-covered ground. One of them looked right at me. His face was pale as moonlight, and there was a hole in his forehead that I could see daylight through. "Fresh recruit," he said to the others. "Captain's gonna want to see him." They started walking toward me. Not fast, not threatening, just walking like soldiers on patrol. But something about their movement was wrong. They didn't bob up and down like normal people walking. They glided, like they were floating an inch above the ground. I ran, crashing through the rhododendron thickets, branches tearing at my uniform. I ran harder than I'd ever run in my life. Behind me, I could hear them following. Not running, just walking at that same steady pace. But somehow they were keeping up. My radio was crackling again, voices coming through the static. But not Jake's voice this time. Different voices, with different accents. "Company B, form up on the ridgeline." "Yes, sir, Captain." "Enemies moving up the valley." "Fix bayonets, boys. This is what we came for." I stopped running and grabbed the radio. "Who is this? Identify. To yourself." The voices continued like they hadn't heard me. "Tell my Martha, I died thinking of her." "Save the colors, Johnny. Don't let them Yankees get our flag." "I can't feel my legs, Sarge. I can't feel my legs." I switched the radio off. But the voices kept coming. Not from the radio now, but from the air around me. Dozens of voices, maybe hundreds, all talking at once. Battle cries and death rattles, orders being shouted and prayers being whispered. When I looked back, the soldiers were gone. But I could feel them watching from the shadows between the trees. I found the missing team 2 hours later. They were camped in a clearing I'd never seen before, even though I'd walked these mountains for 18 years. Their modern expedition tents were arranged in perfect military rows, and their camping gear was laid out with the precision of an army camp. Dr. Chen was sitting by a small fire, wearing what looked like a Civil War-era dress. Her 2 graduate students, Mike and Jennifer, were dressed in gray uniforms that looked just like the ones I'd seen on the ghost soldiers. "Dr. Chen," I called out as I approached the camp. "Are you all right? We've been looking for you." She looked up at me with eyes that weren't quite right. Too bright, like she had a fever. "Oh, hello, Mr. Hartwell. We're doing very well. We've enlisted, you see. All of us. The captain said we could serve with the 25th Virginia Infantry. Isn't that exciting?" Mike looked up from cleaning what appeared to be a Civil War rifle. "We're going to fight at Rich Mountain," he said with a big smile. "The captain says it'll be a great victory for the Confederacy." "Mike, the Battle of Rich Mountain was over 100 years ago," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "And the Confederates lost." Jennifer laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Don't be silly. The battle's tomorrow. We're just waiting for the order to march." I looked around the camp more, carefully. Their modern equipment was still there. GPS units, radios, field computers, but it was all arranged like period artifacts. The GPS units were laid out like they were muskets in a gun rack. The laptops were stacked like ammunition boxes. "Dr. Chen, I need you to come with me. All of you. We need to get off the mountain." She shook her head. "Oh, we can't leave. The captain wouldn't like that. He's been waiting so long for reinforcements. 115 years, he said. Can you imagine? He was so happy when we arrived." "Where is this captain?" "Right here," said a voice behind me. I turned around and felt my blood turn to ice water. The figure standing at the edge of the clearing was 8 feet tall and made of shadow and mist. But within the darkness, I could see the outline of a Confederate officer's uniform. Brass buttons gleamed like fallen stars, and a sword hung at his side. "I am Captain James Beauregard, 25th Virginia Infantry," the thing said in a voice like wind through a graveyard. "And you, sir, are now under my command. We have a battle to fight, and I'll not have deserters in my ranks." The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an instant. Frost began forming on the grass around his feet, and my breath came out in white clouds. You will take up arms for the Confederacy, the captain continued, or you will be shot as a spy. The ghost soldiers I'd seen earlier began emerging from the woods, surrounding the camp. Dozens of them, then hundreds, all carrying rifles with fixed bayonets, all looking at me with hollow, hungry eyes. "Welcome to the war," Dr. Chen said, and her voice wasn't her own anymore. The world around me began to change. The forest faded like smoke, replaced by muddy fields and wooden fortifications. The sound of cannons echoed from the ridges above, and the air filled with the smell of gunpowder and blood. I was standing in the middle of the Battle of Rich Mountain, and it was 1861. Confederate soldiers rushed past me, heading toward earthwork trenches that had appeared where the trees used to be. Some of them had faces I recognized, Mike and Jennifer from the archaeology team, but wearing different clothes and different expressions. Their eyes held the desperate certainty of men who knew they were about to die. "Move, soldier," Captain Beauregard's voice boomed behind me. "The Yankees are advancing up the slope." I could see them now. Blue uniforms moving through the smoke, their bayonets gleaming in the strange twilight that had settled over the battlefield. The sound of rifle fire cracked like thunder, and men began falling all around me. But I wasn't really there. Part of my mind knew I was still standing in a forest clearing in 1976, surrounded by ghosts and missing persons. The battle was just an overlay, like a movie projected onto reality. The question was, which reality was stronger? "This isn't real," I said out loud. The Battle of Rich Mountain ended in 1861. The Confederates retreated. "You lost." Captain Beauregard materialized beside me, more solid now. His face was gaunt, with hollow cheeks and eyes like burned coals. When he smiled, I could see that his teeth were stained with what looked like old blood. "Lost?" he said. "Son, we ain't lost nothing. We've been fighting this battle for over a century, and we'll keep fighting it until we win. Every soul that sets foot on this mountain becomes part of our army. Every death adds to our strength." "You're dead," I said. "All of you. You died in 1861. "Death is just a change of uniform," the captain replied. "And this war ain't over till every last Yankee is driven from Virginia soil." The battle raged around us. I saw Dr. Chen loading a musket with practiced efficiency, her archaeological skills translating perfectly to 19th century warfare. Mike was helping carry wounded soldiers to a field hospital that had appeared behind a rock outcropping. They weren't just dressed like Civil War soldiers. They had become Civil War soldiers, their modern memories fading like morning mist. "How?" I asked. "This ground is soaked in blood and sorrow," Captain Beauregard said. 400 good men died here, far from home, fighting for a cause they believed in. That kind of passion, that kind of sacrifice. It leaves an imprint, and when someone disturbs our rest— He gestured toward the dig site, which had become a Confederate cemetery. Rows of wooden crosses stretched away into the fog, and I could see fresh graves being dug at the far end. "We recruit," he finished. A Union soldier appeared out of the smoke, his bayonet aimed at my chest. Without thinking, I dove to the side and rolled behind a fallen log. The steel blade missed me by inches and buried itself in the wood. The soldier's face was wrong. It kept shifting, like water, cycling through different features. Sometimes it looked like a young man from the Doubt 1860 seconds. Sometimes like a modern hiker I'd helped rescue 2 years ago. Sometimes like my own father. "The living memory feeds the dead memory," Captain Beauregard explained as I cowered behind the log. "Every person who dies on this mountain, every person who joins our cause, makes the battle more real. Soon, this will be the only reality. 1861 forever, and the war that never ends." I understood then. The spirits weren't just haunting the mountain, necks. They were trying to replace the present with the past. Every person they recruited made their version of reality stronger. Eventually, the entire area would become a pocket of 1861, trapped in an endless loop of battle and death. "What about the archaeology team?" "They will serve with honor," the captain said. "In time, they will forget they were ever anything but Confederate soldiers. Their expertise will help us build better fortifications, plan better strategies. We will finally win this battle." A musket ball whistled past my ear, and I realized I had to choose. I could let them recruit me, become part of their eternal army, and lose myself in the Phantom War. Or I could find a way to break the cycle. But how do you fight an entire army of the dead? The answer came to me when I saw the Confederate flag flying from a makeshift flagpole in the center of the camp. It was torn and stained, but the soldiers guarded it like their lives depended on it. Because to them, it wasn't just a piece of cloth, it was everything they had died for. I pulled out my Ranger badge, the gold star I'd worn for 18 years. It wasn't much, but it represented something the ghosts couldn't understand. Peace. The war they were fighting was over, had been over for more than a century. "Captain," I called out, standing up from behind the log, "I've got something to show you." He materialized in front of me, sword drawn. "Surrender or die, Yankee." "I'm not a Yankee," I said. "I'm Samuel Hartwell, descendant of Private William Hartwell, 3rd West Virginia Infantry. My great-great-grandfather fought at this very battle." The captain's expression changed slightly. "Hartwell, I remember that name. Good soldier. Died trying to save the colors when you people overran our position." "He survived," I said. "Lived to be 83 years old, had 6 children and 14 grandchildren." "The war ended, Captain. Both sides went home." "Lies." But there was uncertainty in his voice. In 1865, Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The Confederate States of America ceased to exist. The United States became one country again. I held up my badge. This is the symbol of that united country. I took an oath to protect all Americans, whether their ancestors wore blue or gray. The battle sounds began to fade. Some of the ghost soldiers were looking confused, like they were waking up from a long dream. "You died fighting for your homeland," I continued. "That took courage. But your homeland survived. It became part of something bigger, something that honored the sacrifice of men like you. Your fight is over, Captain. You won. Virginia is safe. It's time to rest." Captain Beauregard's form was becoming less solid, more like smoke than shadow. "Rest. We have not rested in so long. There's no shame in laying down your arms," I said. "The war is over. You can stop fighting now." One by one, the ghost soldiers began to fade. Some saluted before they disappeared. Others simply turned and walked away into the mist. The battlefield was dissolving, the 1,861 reality cracking like old paint. Captain Beauregard was the last to go. He sheathed his sword and looked at me with eyes that were finally at peace. "Tell them we fought well," he said. "I will." And then he was gone, and I was standing in a forest clearing in 1976, surrounded by 3 very confused archaeologists and a pile of Civil War artifacts that had materialized out of thin air. Dr. Chen and her team didn't remember much about their 3 days on the mountain. They had vague recollections of strange dreams and the feeling that they'd been somewhere else, but the details were fuzzy, like trying to remember a half-forgotten childhood memory. The official report listed it as a case of shared hypothermia-induced hallucinations. The team had gotten lost in fog, spent 3 days wandering in circles, and suffered from exposure and dehydration. It was thin, but it was better than trying to explain what had really happened. The archaeological dig was suspended indefinitely. The site was declared geologically unstable due to previously unknown mine shafts in the area. The artifacts that had appeared during our encounter with the Confederate ghosts were quietly transferred to the West Virginia State Museum, where they're stored in a basement vault marked Origin Unknown. I kept my mouth shut about the supernatural aspects of the incident. Who would have believed me? But I did start researching the history of Rich Mountain more thoroughly. What I found changed how I looked at these mountains forever. The Battle of Rich Mountain was just one of dozens of violent events that had taken place in the Appalachians over the centuries. Cherokee removal routes, Revolutionary War skirmishes, mining accidents that killed hundreds of men, family feuds that turned into small wars. Every valley, every ridge, every hidden hollow had its own bloody history. And according to the old-timers I started talking to, Rich Mountain wasn't the only place where the dead walked. There were stories from all over the region. Phantom armies marching along ridge lines, ghost towns that appeared in the fog and disappeared by morning, miners who'd been dead for 50 years, still working shifts in abandoned coal seams. The mountains remember everything. I transferred to a different district 6 months later. Officially, it was for career, the advancement opportunities. Unofficially, I couldn't stand being in the Dolly Sods wilderness anymore. Every time the fog rolled in, every time I heard a sound I couldn't immediately identify, I found myself looking for gray uniforms moving between the trees. But transferring didn't help much. The new district had its own stories, its own restless dead. A lumber camp where a fire had killed 37 workers in 1923. A Cherokee village site where the spirits of the forcibly removed still gathered on certain nights. A stretch of old railroad track where a passenger train had derailed in a blizzard, killing everyone aboard. I've been a ranger for 28 years now, and I've learned to read the signs. The unnatural silence, the temperature drops, the way compasses spin and radios pick up voices from the past. When those things happen, I do my job. I make sure no living person gets too close to whatever's stirring in the shadows. Because the dead don't always stay buried in these mountains. Sometimes they need to be reminded that their watch is over, that they can finally rest. And sometimes, when you're walking alone on a misty ridge at sunset, you can hear them marching, still keeping guard over valleys that exist now only in memory, still fighting wars that ended before your grandfather was born. The mountains remember everything, every victory, every defeat, every life, every death. And sometimes, when the conditions are just right, the memories bleed through. That's why I always carry my ranger badge when I'm on patrol. Not for the living, they know who I am. I carry it for the dead, to remind them that the country they died defending is still here, still worth protecting, still at peace. Most of the time, that's enough. Most of the time. But on foggy October nights, when the wind carries sounds that don't belong to any living thing, I remember Captain Beauregard's words. This war ain't over till every last Yankee is driven from Virginia soil. West Virginia was carved out of Virginia during the Civil War. Technically, we're all Yankees here now. And I sometimes wonder if all those Confederate ghosts got the memo. My name is Margaret Blackstone, and I've been a ranger in the Daniel Boone National Forest for 12 years. I specialize in cave rescue and geological surveys, which means when someone gets trapped underground in Kentucky, they call me. People think cave rescue is about knowing fancy rope techniques or having the right equipment. That's part of it, sure. But the real skill is reading the mountain, understanding how water moves through limestone, knowing which passages will flood when the spring rains come. After 12 years crawling through these caves, I can feel when something's wrong just by how the air moves. I wasn't always a ranger. Used to be a mining engineer, working the coal operations in eastern Kentucky. Good money, steady work. But when my little sister died from black lung at 28, I decided I'd had enough of pulling things out of the earth. Now I spend my time getting people out instead. The old-timers in these mountains talk about knocker spirits, little creatures that live in mines and caves, tapping on the walls to warn miners about cave-ins. Dad used to say they were the spirits of miners who died underground, still trying to keep people safe. I always figured it was just superstition, something to explain the random sounds you hear when you're deep in the earth with only your headlamp for company. That was before Copper Creek Cave. It was March 15th, 1984, when I got the call. Heavy spring rains had been falling for 3 days, and half the cave systems in the Red River Gorge were flooding. A group of experienced cavers had gone into the Copper Creek system that morning and hadn't come out. Their surface support team found their vehicles still parked at the old mining access road. 5 people, 2 couples from Louisville, and a caving instructor from the university. The Copper Creek system is tricky. It connects to an abandoned copper mine that was sealed back in 1923. The mine has a bad history. In 1912, there was a collapse that killed 23 workers, 21 men and 2 supervisors. What made it worse was that some of the workers were just kids, boys as young as 8, working the shafts because their families needed the money. When I arrived at the site, the water was already rising. The main entrance to the cave was a narrow crack in the limestone, barely wide enough for a person. The cavers' support team had been calling into the cave for 2 hours with no response. Their emergency beacon went off about an hour ago, said Jim Carey, the team leader. He was a thin man with nervous hands, the kind who spent too many hours worrying about people underground. Signals coming from somewhere deep in the system, deeper than we've ever mapped. I checked my equipment: headlamp, backup lights, rope, emergency beacon, first aid kit, everything I'd need for a standard rescue. The plan was simple: follow the beacon signal, find the cavers, guide them out. I'd done it dozens of times before. But as I squeezed through the cave entrance, something felt wrong. The air was moving strangely, flowing upward instead of down toward the lower passages. And it was warm. Cave temperature should be constant, around 55 degrees. This air felt like it was coming from somewhere much deeper, somewhere that remembered the heat of the Earth's core. The first 100 yards were normal. Standard limestone passage, knee-deep water from the recent rains. I followed the emergency beacon signal, my headlamp cutting through the darkness ahead. The sound of dripping water echoed off the walls, mixing with the distant rumble of underground streams. Then I heard singing. It was faint, barely audible over the water sounds. A child's voice, singing what sounded like an old work song. The kind miners used to sing to keep time while they worked. But that was impossible. No children came into these caves. The singing seemed to be coming from somewhere ahead, in the direction of the beacon signal. I called out, "Hello, this is Cave Rescue. Can you hear me?" The singing stopped. But in the silence that followed, I heard something else. The distant sound of metal on stone. Like someone was working with a pickaxe, far underground. I moved forward, following the beacon signal deeper into the cave. The passage began to change. The limestone gave way to hand-carved tunnel walls. I was entering the old mine workings. But according to the Geological Survey, this section had been sealed for 60 years. How had the cavers gotten through? My headlamp beam caught something carved into the wall. Letters scratched deep into the stone. T. Brasher, 1912. Below it, someone had carved a small cross. Tommy Brasher. I knew that name. He was one of the children who died in the 1912 collapse. 12 years old. The beacon signal was getting stronger. I was close to the trapped cavers, but something was very wrong with this place. The air was too warm, the passages too open. And somewhere ahead, I could hear voices. Not adult voices calling for help. Children's voices, singing in the dark. I followed the beacon signal deeper into the mine. The hand-carved passages were wider here, with timber supports that should have rotted away decades ago. But they looked fresh, like they'd been installed yesterday. My headlamp beam caught the glint of metal tracks running along the floor. Mining cart rails, with no rust on them. The temperature kept rising. By the time I'd gone another 100 yards, I was sweating inside my rescue gear. This wasn't normal. Caves maintain constant temperature, but this felt like I was descending into an active mine, full of heat from working machinery and human bodies. That's when I found the first piece of equipment. It was sitting on a ledge carved into the tunnel wall, a small safety lamp, the kind miners used before electric lights. But it wasn't an antique. The metal was polished, the wick trimmed, the oil reservoir full. A thin ribbon of smoke rose from the flame, which meant someone had lit it recently, very recently. I picked up the lamp and examined it. Scratched into the base were the initials TB, Tommy Brasher. But that was impossible. This lamp should be 70 years old, buried under tons of collapsed rock. "Hello," I called again. "Cave Rescue, if you can hear me, make some noise." This time, I got an answer. Not from adults, but from children's voices echoing through the tunnels ahead. "She's coming to help. Tell her about the water. Show her the safe way." I stopped moving. There were no children in this cave system. The trapped cavers were all adults. But those voices were clear, distinct. Young voices, maybe 8 to 12 years old. The beacon signal was pulling me forward, toward a junction where 3 tunnels met. My headlamp revealed more impossible things. Fresh chalk marks on the walls, showing direction, arrows, a pile of mining tools that should have been scrap metal decades ago, still sharp and ready for work. And footprints in the mud. Small footprints, like children's bare feet. I chose the tunnel the beacon signal was strongest in. After 50 yards, it opened into a larger chamber carved out of the living rock. And there, in the middle of the chamber, I found them. All 5 cavers, sitting in a circle like they were having a meeting. They looked up when my headlamp beam hit them, squinting in the sudden light. "Thank God," said one of them. "A woman named Sarah Chen. We've been waiting for you." "Are you hurt?" I asked, moving toward them. "How did you get so deep into the mine workings?" "The children showed us," said another caver, a man named Dave Richards. He pointed to one of the tunnel entrances. "They said this was the safe place, away from the water." I looked where he was pointing. There was no water in this chamber. In fact, it was completely dry, which shouldn't be possible with all the flooding above. "What children?" I asked. The cavers exchanged glances. Sarah spoke first. "We got trapped when the water started rising. We thought we were done for. Then these kids appeared. Maybe 10 or 12 years old, carrying little lanterns. They showed us the way through passages we hadn't seen before. Where are these children now?" "They come and go," Dave said. "They keep telling us to wait here, that someone's coming to get us out safely." I looked around the chamber. Besides the entrance I'd used, there were 3 other tunnel mouths leading off into darkness. According to my geological surveys, none of these passages should exist. The mine was supposed to end 100 yards back. "We need to leave now," I said. "The water level is rising. This whole system could flood." But when I turned back toward the entrance I'd used, I couldn't find it. My headlamp beams swept the chamber walls. 4 tunnel entrances, all leading into darkness. The one I'd come through was gone. "That's what happened to us," Sarah said quietly. "The tunnels keep changing. The children said it's safer if we stay together, wait for the grown-ups to come get us." I checked my emergency beacon. It was working, still transmitting our location. But according to the signal, we were 300 feet deeper underground than the lowest point of the original mine. That was impossible. The geological surveys showed solid limestone below us. From somewhere in the tunnels around us came the sound of children singing again. Closer this time. And underneath the singing, I heard the rhythm of pickaxes striking stone. Like somewhere nearby, people were still working the mine. "Have you seen them clearly?" I asked the cavers. "These children? Not really," Dave admitted. "They stay in the shadows mostly, but their voices are clear, and their lanterns, old-fashioned oil lamps, like you'd see in a museum." I thought about the lamp I'd found. T.B. Tommy Brasher, a child who died in these tunnels 72 years ago. The singing was getting louder, and now I could see lights moving in the tunnels. Small, flickering lights that danced like flame, moving toward our chamber from all 4 entrances. "Everyone stay together," I said, checking my rope and climbing gear. "We're getting out of here, now." But as the lights grew brighter, I began to see the figures carrying them. Small shapes in the tunnel mouths. Children in old-fashioned clothes, holding safety lamps. Their faces were pale in the lamplight, their eyes dark and serious. And they were singing a mining song I recognized. One my grandfather used to hum when he talked about his days working underground. "We're here to help," called a young voice from the nearest tunnel. "We know the safe way out." But looking at those small figures in the lamplight, I wasn't sure their idea of safe was the same as mine. The children emerged from the tunnels like shadows becoming real. There were at least a dozen of them, maybe more. Boys mostly, wearing rough work clothes and canvas pants that would have been common in the early 1900s. They carried their safety lamps carefully, the way children handle something precious. The closest one couldn't have been more than 10 years old. His face was smudged with coal dust, and his eyes had the serious look of someone who'd grown up too fast. "I'm Tommy," he said, holding up his lamp. "Tommy Brasher. We've been waiting for you folks to come down." My blood went cold. Tommy Brasher. The name from the carved wall. The initials on the lamp I'd found. "Tommy," I said carefully, "how long have you been down here?" He tilted his head, thinking. "Hard to say, miss. Time moves different in the deep places. But we've been working, keeping the tunnels safe for when people come through." The other children nodded. I could see them more clearly now in the combined light of their lamps. All boys except for 2 girls who looked like they might be sisters. All of them had that same serious expression, that same way of standing like they were ready to get back to work. "The water's rising up top," said one of the girls. "We can hear it coming down through the old workings. But we know the dry passages, the safe places." Sarah Chen spoke up. "They've been taking care of us." showing us where to find fresh air, where the ground is solid. Taking care of you, how? I asked. They brought us food, Dave said. Or what looked like food, hard biscuits and water from somewhere. Tasted strange, but we were hungry. I didn't like the sound of that. I'd done enough cave rescues to know that eating or drinking anything of unknown origin underground was dangerous. But the cavers looked healthy enough, just tired and scared. We need to get to the surface, I told Tommy. All of us. The mountain is flooding. Oh, we know about floods, miss, Tommy said. Seen plenty of them, but the surface isn't safe right now. Too much water coming down. Better to wait it out down here, where we can keep you protected. Protected from what? Tommy and the other children exchanged glances. The kind of look kids share when they know something adults don't understand. From drowning, miss. From getting lost in the dark. From cave-ins. He gestured around the chamber. This is a good place. Strong supports. Good air. We've been keeping it ready for folks like you. I examined the chamber more carefully. The timber supports were indeed solid, but they had a strange quality. They looked both ancient and new at the same time, and the air was warm, almost humid, like it was coming from someplace much deeper in the earth. How many people have you helped? I asked. Oh, lots of folks over the years, said one of the other boys. Miners who got lost, people who came down exploring. We always take care of them. Where are these people now? The children went quiet. Tommy looked down at his lamp, watching the flame flicker. Safe, he said finally. They're all safe now. Don't have to worry about cave-ins or flooding or anything bad happening to them. Something cold settled in my stomach. I'd been in enough dangerous situations to recognize when things were about to go very wrong. Listen, I said to the cavers, we need to move. Now, follow me, stay together, and don't listen to anyone else. But when I turned toward what I thought was the exit tunnel, it wasn't there anymore. The chamber now had 5 entrances instead of 4, and none of them looked familiar. Don't worry, miss, Tommy said. We'll show you the right way when it's time. But first, you should rest. The work down here is hard. Gets to people if they're not used to it. What work? Tommy held up his lamp, and the light caught something I hadn't noticed before. Behind the children, the walls of the chamber were covered with pickaxes, shovels, and other mining tools. All of them looked recently used. Mining work, miss, keeping the tunnels clear, making sure the supports are strong. There's always work to do in a mine. The temperature in the chamber was rising. I could feel sweat running down my back despite the fact that we were supposed to be hundreds of feet underground in a naturally cool cave system. We're not miners, I said. We're just here to get out safely. Everyone's a miner down here, said one of the girls. That's how you stay safe. By working together. By knowing the tunnels. By listening to those who've been here longest. The singing started again, but now it was coming from the chamber itself. The children's voices blending together in an old mining song about working deep underground where the sun never shines. And as they sang, I noticed something that made my mouth go dry. The children were becoming more solid, more real. Their clothes had looked less faded, their faces clearer. But the chamber around us was starting to change too. The modern climbing ropes I'd used to get here were gone. My emergency beacon was no longer clipped to my gear, and when I looked at the other cavers, they were staring at their hands in confusion. Where's my watch? Sarah whispered. My headlamp, Dave said. It's gone. How is it gone? The children's lamps were providing all the light now. Warm, flickering oil flame light that cast dancing shadows on the walls. And in those shadows, I could see more figures. Adult miners in period clothes, standing quietly behind the children. Welcome to the mine, Tommy said, his voice echoing strangely in the chamber. Don't worry about the surface anymore. Don't worry about floods or cave-ins or anything bad. You're safe here. We'll take good care of you. The singing got louder, and somewhere deeper in the tunnels, I could hear the sound of pickaxes striking stone, like a whole crew of miners was working the shafts, just out of sight. We're going to be late for the shift, Tommy said, checking a pocket watch that definitely hadn't been there a moment before. Better get you folks settled in before the foreman comes around. That's when I realized we weren't just trapped in the mine. We were being recruited. Listen to me, I said to the cavers, my voice sharp with urgency. Don't touch anything they give you. Don't eat or drink anything. And whatever you do, don't agree to work in this mine." The children looked confused, hurt even. Tommy stepped closer, his lamp casting strange shadows across his young face. "But miss, everyone works in the mine. That's how we all stay together, how we stay safe." "You're not safe," I said. "You're dead. You all died in 1912 when the mine collapsed. You're trying to make us like you." The chamber went silent except for the distant sound of pickaxes. The children stared at me, their expressions shifting from confusion to something darker. "We're not dead," said one of the girls. "We're here. We're working. We're taking care of people." "Look around you," I said to the cavers. "Really look. Do you see any way out? Do you remember how you got here?" Sarah Chen blinked, like she was waking up from a dream. We were in a limestone cave, following the underground stream. "How did we get into a mine?" "The same way everyone gets into the mine," Tommy said patiently. "You follow the lights, you listen to the voices, you come where it's safe." But I could see understanding dawning in the cavers' faces. Dave looked at his hands, then at the chamber around us. "This isn't real," he whispered. "This can't be real." "It's as real as it needs to be," said another child, a boy who looked about 12. "Real enough to keep you safe forever." The adult figures behind the children stepped forward into the lamplight. Miners in old-fashioned work clothes, their faces pale but determined. And I realized these weren't just the children who died in 1912. These were everyone who'd ever been rescued by the little miners. "How many?" I asked Tommy. "How many people have you brought down here?" "Everyone we could save," he said proudly. "Folks who got lost in the caves, people who came exploring, even some of the old-timers who worked the mine before the collapse. We never let anyone stay lost in the dark." I counted the figures I could see, at least 30 people, maybe more. Men and women from different eras, judging by their clothes. Some looked recent, hikers and cavers in modern gear. Others were clearly from decades past. "Where's the real exit?" I demanded. "The way back to the actual cave system?" Tommy shook his head. "There's no exit, miss. This is where people come to be safe, forever safe." That's when I understood. The spirits weren't trying to hurt us. They were trying to save us. In their minds, bringing people into their spiritual mine was the ultimate rescue. No more floods. No more cave-ins. No more danger. No more life. "The beacon," I said to Sarah. "Do you still have your emergency beacon?" She checked her gear. It was here. I know it was here. They took them, I realized. They don't want us to be found. "Nobody needs to find you," Tommy said. "You're where you need to be." The chamber was getting warmer. The air was thick, hard to breathe, and the walls were starting to change, becoming more solid, more real. The spiritual mine was claiming us, making us part of it. "We have to get out," I told the cavers. "Right now, before we can't anymore." I pulled out my climbing rope, looking for an anchor point. But the chamber walls were smooth stone now, with no cracks or irregularities I could use. "Please, miss," Tommy said. "Don't fight it. It's better this way. No more worrying about the surface. No more danger." "What about your families?" I asked the children. "Don't you want to see your families again?" For the first time, Tommy looked uncertain. "Our families are gone, been gone a long time." "But our families are still alive," Sarah said, catching on. "Our families are looking for us." "They'll forget," said one of the girls. "People forget, but we never forget. We take care of everyone who comes down here." I could feel the spiritual weight of the mine settling around us like a heavy blanket. My modern equipment was becoming less real, less useful. Soon we'd be part of this place forever, helping to rescue the next group of cavers who wandered too deep. That's when I remembered something my grandfather used to say about mine spirits. They weren't evil. They were trapped by their own good intentions, trying to save people the only way they knew how. "Tommy," I said, "what if there was a way to really save people? A way to get them back to their families safely?" He looked interested despite himself. "How?" "Show us the way out. Guide us back to the real cave. Let us go back to the surface and tell people to stay away from dangerous places. That would save more lives than keeping us here." Tommy considered this. The other children whispered among themselves. "But if you leave," he said, "you might get hurt. You might die." We might, I agreed, but we might not. And if we live, we can make sure other people don't get lost down here. Isn't that better than saving just a few people? The children argued quietly in their old-fashioned way, serious and thoughtful. Finally, Tommy nodded. "We'll show you the way out," he said. "But you have to promise. Promise you'll tell people to be careful in the deep places. I promise." Tommy raised his lamp, and suddenly I could see it. A narrow passage I'd missed before, leading back toward cooler air and the sound of running water. The real cave system. "Go quick," Tommy said. Before we change our minds, we followed Tommy's lamp through passages that seemed to shift and change around us. Sometimes we were walking through hand-carved mine tunnels with timber supports and metal tracks. Other times we were crawling through natural limestone caves with flowstone formations. The transition back to reality was gradual but unmistakable. The air grew cooler. The sound of underground streams became louder. My headlamp flickered back to life, and I could feel the weight of my emergency beacon clipped to my gear again. "Here," Tommy said, pointing to a narrow crack in the cave wall. "This way leads up. Follow the water flow. It'll take you to the main passage." "What about you?" I asked. Tommy smiled, and for a moment he looked like any 12-year-old boy. "We have work to do. Mines need tending, but we'll remember our promise." "Tommy," I said, "you and the others, you don't have to keep working. You can rest now." He shook his head. "Not yet, miss. Too many people still get lost down here. But maybe someday." The children's lamps were growing dimmer, their voices fainter. As we squeezed through the crack toward the main cave passage, I could hear them singing one last time, that old mining song, but softer now, almost peaceful. The rescue was routine after that. We followed the underground stream to the main passage, then climbed out through the original entrance. The surface team was waiting with medical equipment and hot coffee. All 5 cavers were dehydrated and exhausted, but unharmed. I filed my official report 3 days later. Equipment failure due to flooding. Cavers became disoriented in unmapped sections of the cave system. Standard rescue protocol followed successfully. No mention of spirits or impossible mine passages. But I did make some other changes. I petitioned the Forest Service to have the Copper Creek area declared off-limits to recreational caving. I cited geological instability and flood danger. The petition was approved. Signs were posted. The cave entrance was gated and locked. I also spent 2 weeks in the county records office, researching the 1,912 mine disaster, 23 dead, 21 adult miners and 2 supervisors, the official report said. But the handwritten notes in the margins told a different story. 21 adults and 2 children, boys who were working illegally because their families needed the money. I started a memorial fund for child mining victims in Appalachian, Kentucky. Not much money, but enough to put up a small plaque near the old mine entrance. It lists all 23 names, including Tommy Brasher, age 12. Every few months, I go back to check on the cave entrance. The gate is always secure, the warning signs intact. But sometimes, when the wind is right, you can hear singing from underground. Children's voices, carrying old mining songs through the limestone passages. Other rangers have started reporting similar incidents. Cavers getting lost in impossible places throughout the Appalachian mountain system. Always in areas with abandoned mining operations. Always involving helpful voices that lead people deeper underground before someone like me has to go get them out. The mountains remember everything. Every injustice, every tragedy, every life cut short by dangerous work and corporate greed. And sometimes, that memory takes the form of children who died too young, still trying to keep people safe the only way they know how. I keep my promise to Tommy and the others. I tell people to be careful in the deep places, to respect the darkness and the stone, to remember that the mountains are full of ghosts, and some of them are trying to help. But I also know that someday, when the last person who remembers the child mining victims is gone, those spirits might finally be able to rest. Until then, they'll keep working their shifts in the darkness, keeping the tunnels safe, waiting for someone to remember their price. Sacrifice. The mountains never forget. And now, neither do I. Asterisk. If you're ever hiking in Kentucky's cave country and you hear children singing underground, don't follow the sound. Mark the location and call the Forest Service. Some rescues require professional help, and some children have been working much too long and deserve to finally go home. Asterisk. My name is Ezekiel Crenshaw, and I've spent 22 years walking through the forests of Tennessee. Most folks call me Zeke. I'm what they call a timber specialist for the Cherokee National Forest, which means I know trees like some people know cars. I can tell you what kind of tree you're looking at just by touching the bark, and I know which ones are sick before they start showing it. I wasn't always a tree hugger, though. My daddy and his daddy before him were loggers. We cut down trees for a living. Big ones, little ones, didn't matter. A tree was just wood waiting to become lumber. That changed when I got this job with the Forest Service. Started seeing trees different. Started understanding they weren't just standing there waiting to die. But even after all these years, I never believed in the old Cherokee stories. You know the ones? Trees that could think, spirits living in the bark, that kind of thing. My Cherokee friends would shake their heads when I'd laugh about it. Some groves are different, Zeke, they'd tell me. Some trees have been watching longer than you think. I thought it was just old stories. Until August of 1988. That summer was hot and dry like I'd never seen. We had fire warnings posted everywhere, and I was spending most of my time checking for sparks and dead wood. The whole forest felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something bad to happen. The call came on a Tuesday morning. I was drinking coffee in my truck when the radio crackled to life. 3-man survey team had gone missing in the Joyce-Kilmer Wilderness. They were supposed to be marking old-growth trees for protection, the really big ones that had been standing since before Columbus. But they'd missed their check-in 2 days ago. Joyce-Kilmer is special. It's one of the last pieces of true virgin forest in the Appalachians. Some of those tulip poplars are 400 years old and tall as skyscrapers. The Cherokee used to say it was sacred ground, but then again, they said that about a lot of places. I packed my gear and headed out. 15 miles from the nearest trail, deep in the roadless wilderness where most people never go. The missing team was led by Dr. Sarah Chen, a forestry professor from the university. Good people. Smart people. Not the type to get lost or do something stupid. The hike-in took most of the morning. The deeper I went, the quieter things got. Usually the forest is full of sounds, birds, squirrels, insects buzzing. But as I walked toward the ancient grove, everything went silent. Even my footsteps seemed too loud. The big trees started appearing around noon. Tulip poplars so wide that 6 people holding hands couldn't circle them. Their trunks rose straight up like cathedral columns, disappearing into the canopy somewhere above my head. It was beautiful and strange at the same time. Made me feel small, like I was walking into a church built by God himself. I found their base camp first. 3 tents set up neat and proper, equipment laid out like they'd just stepped away for a minute. Coffee pot was still on the camp stove, half full but stone cold. Personal stuff was all there. Wallets, keys, even Dr. Chen's purse. Nobody leaves that behind. But no people, anywhere. I called out their names until my throat was sore. Sarah. Mike. David. The sound echoed weird in the grove, like the trees were swallowing my voice. I checked every tent, looked through all their notes. The last entry in Dr. Chen's logbook was from Saturday morning. Beginning survey of Specimen Grove. Some of these poplars may be 500+ years old. Remarkable preservation. That's when I found their survey equipment. It was scattered around the biggest tree in the grove, a monster poplar that had to be the grandmother of them all. But something was wrong with the setup. Their survey stakes, the metal spikes they used to mark trees, were driven deep into the hardwood. Not the ground, the tree itself. I've been working with trees my whole life, and I know you can't drive a metal stake into living hardwood. Not with a hammer, not with a sledge, not with a jackhammer. The wood's too dense, too alive. But there they were, 6 inches deep in bark that should have been hard as stone. I tried to pull one out. It wouldn't budge. Felt like it had grown into the tree, like the wood had healed around it. That's when I noticed the forest was too quiet. Not just quiet, empty. No bird songs, no insect buzz, nothing. In 22 years of forest work, I'd never heard silence like that. It felt wrong, like the whole grove was waiting for something. I decided to make camp and wait for morning. Maybe the survey team had gone exploring and would come back. Maybe I was missing something obvious. But as I set up my tent in the fading light, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from those ancient trees. The sun set early in the grove, blocked by the massive canopy above. As darkness fell, I heard the first sound I'd heard all day. Singing. A woman's voice, soft and beautiful, coming from somewhere in the trees. It sounded sad and lonely, like a lullaby sung by someone who'd been crying. I grabbed my flashlight and followed the sound, but it seemed to move through the forest, always just ahead of me, always just out of sight. I followed it until I realized I was walking in circles around the big poplar. The singing was coming from inside the tree itself. That's when I knew the old Cherokee stories might not be stories after all. I didn't sleep much that first night. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear that singing again. Soft and sad, like someone humming a lullaby to themselves. When I'd sit up and listen hard, it would stop. When I'd lay back down, it would start again. By morning, I was jumpy as a cat. I made coffee with shaking hands and tried to think like a ranger instead of like a scared kid. People don't just disappear. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe the survey team had fallen into a sinkhole. Maybe they'd gotten turned around and wandered off. Maybe someone was playing games with me. But deep down, I knew something was very wrong with this place. I started a proper search at first light, working in expanding circles from their camp. That's when I found the clothes. Dr. Chen's jacket was hanging from a low branch like someone had draped it there to dry. But when I got closer, I saw the branch hadn't been broken or bent. It had grown through the jacket. The wood had somehow twisted around the fabric and kept growing, trapping it in the bark. 50 yards away, I found a boot. Mike's boot, according to the size and brand. It was stuck in the trunk of a young maple, like the tree had just grown around it overnight. The leather was split and stretched, like something inside the tree had been trying to get out. I pulled out my camera and started taking pictures. Nobody would believe this without proof. Trees don't eat clothes. Trees don't grow that fast. But the evidence was right there in front of me. That's when I heard the voice. Zeke. Clear as day, coming from the big poplar. A woman's voice, soft and sweet. I spun around, but there was nobody there. Just me and the trees and that terrible quiet. Zeke, come closer. I looked up at the big tree. Its bark was smooth and gray, marked with the kind of scars that come from centuries of storms and seasons. But as I stared at it, I started to see patterns in the bark. Lines that looked almost like a face. Eyes that seemed to be watching me. I've been waiting for you, the voice said. I backed away from the tree, my hands shaking. Who's there? Where are you? The bark on the big poplar started to shift. Not fast, but slow like thick honey. The lines that looked like a face became clearer. Eyes, nose, mouth, a woman's face, beautiful and sad, looking at me from inside the wood. I'm right here, Zeke. I've always been here. This isn't real, I said out loud. Trees don't talk, don't they? The face in the bark smiled. You've been listening to me sing all your life. Every time you walk through the forest, every time you put your hand on a tree. We've been talking to you, but you weren't ready to hear. I wanted to run. Every part of my brain was screaming at me to get out of there. But my feet felt rooted to the ground, like something was holding me in place. What happened to the survey team? I managed to ask. They're safe, she said. They're with me now. Like you could be. Where are they? The woman in the tree gestured with a hand made of bark and leaves. Around the grove, other trees started to show faces. 3 of them. Dr. Chen's face was visible in a young oak, her eyes closed like she was sleeping. Mike and David were in maple trees nearby, their features peaceful but frozen in the wood. Jesus Christ, I whispered. They're not dead, Zeke. They're part of something bigger now. Part of the forest. They'll never be cold or hungry or lonely again. They'll live as long as the trees live. Let them go. I can't do that, but I can offer you the same gift. The face in the poplar leaned forward, and I could smell spring flowers and fresh earth. I've been alone for so long. The Cherokee used to visit me, used to bring me offerings and songs. But they were taken away, and I've had no one to talk to for more than 100 years. You're a dryad, I said. The word came from somewhere deep in my memory, from old books I'd read as a kid. A tree spirit. I was Cherokee once, a long time ago. My name was Ayanna. I was chosen to guard this grove, to protect the ancient trees. But the soldiers came and took my people away. I was the only one left, so I became one with the trees to keep them safe. The survey team were going to mark my trees for dye, the cutting. I couldn't let that happen, so I kept them with me. And now they understand. They're part of the grove's protection. I looked around at the faces in the trees. They all looked peaceful, but their eyes were empty. Whatever made them human was gone. I won't let you do this, I said. You don't have a choice, Zeke. You're already changing. I looked down at my hands. The skin was turning rough and brown. My fingers were stretching out like twigs. Bark was growing up my arms. Fight it if you want, Ayanna said. But it's easier if you don't. You'll still be you, just more. Part of something eternal, part of the forest's memory. I tried to run, but my feet wouldn't move. Roots were growing from my boots, digging into the earth. The bark was spreading up my chest now, rough and tight. I could feel my heartbeat slowing down, matching the slow pulse of sap in the trees. Don't fight it, Zeke. Join us. Be with us forever. The grove started to spin around me. The faces in the trees were smiling now, welcoming me home. Ayanna's voice was everywhere, singing that sad, beautiful lullaby. I was almost gone when I remembered my radio. The radio was clipped to my belt, just below where the bark had started growing over my ribs. I could barely feel my fingers anymore, but I managed to grab it and hit the emergency button. Mayday, Mayday, this is Ranger Crenshaw and Joyce Kilmer. Officer down, I need immediate assistance. The voice that crackled back was Bill Henderson from the ranger station. Zeke, what's your situation? You sound funny. Bill, listen to me carefully. Don't send anyone into the grove. The big poplar grove in the center of Joyce Kilmer. Something's wrong here. The survey team is dead. Dead? Jesus. Zeke, what happened? I looked at the faces in the trees around me. They weren't dead, exactly, but they weren't alive either. Just don't send anyone, Bill. I'm going to try to get out, but if you don't hear from me in 6 hours, call in a helicopter. Don't let anyone walk in here. Zeke, you're breaking up. Zeke, Zeke. The radio went silent. Either the signal was gone or the bark growing over my chest had covered it up. But something about hearing Bill's voice had broken the spell. I could move again. I yanked my feet out of the roots and stumbled away from the big poplar. The bark on my skin was cracking and falling off like old paint. It hurt like hell, but I was human again. You can't leave, Zeke. Ayanna's voice followed me through the grove. You've seen too much. You know what I am now. I kept walking, trying to find the path back to my truck. But the grove was different now. Trees that I knew had been small saplings were suddenly massive and old. Paths I'd walked that morning were gone, replaced by thick undergrowth. It was like the forest was rearranging itself to keep me lost. This is my home, Zeke. I control everything here. The trees, the paths, the very ground you walk on. I tried to follow my GPS, but the screen showed nothing but static. My compass spun in wild circles. The sun was hidden by the canopy, so I couldn't tell which direction was which. Every tree I passed seemed to have a face in its bark. Some I recognized, Cherokee faces from old photographs I'd seen in the tribal museum. Others were strangers, men and women who'd been absorbed into the grove over the years. How many people had disappeared in these woods? How many had become part of Ayanna's collection? I don't want to hurt you, Zeke, her voice whispered from every direction. I just want you to stay, to be my companion. It's so lonely here. Find someone else, I called out, pushing through a wall of thorns that hadn't been there before. I tried. The hikers who come through, they're not right. Too young, too afraid, too empty. But you understand trees. You love the forest like I do. You could be happy here. The thorns were getting thicker, growing as fast as I could cut through them. My jacket was shredded, and blood was running down my arms, but I kept moving. That's when I heard the screaming. It was coming from up ahead, through the trees. A man's voice, terrified and desperate. I followed the sound and found myself in a small clearing I'd never seen before. In the center was a huge oak tree, bigger around than a car. The screaming was coming from inside the tree. I put my ear against the bark and heard it clearly. Someone was trapped inside the trunk, banging against the wood from the inside. "Help me, please. I can't move. I can't." The voice cut off suddenly. "That was Thomas Whitehawk," Ayanna said behind me. "He was a Cherokee activist, came here 5 years ago to protest a logging permit. He wanted to chain himself to my trees to protect them. So I protected him." I spun around. She was standing there in human form now, but not quite human. 12 feet tall, with skin, like bark and hair made of leaves, beautiful and terrible at the same time. "How many?" I asked. "How many what? How many people have you taken?" She thought for a moment. "I don't remember. Time moves differently here. Decades feel like days. I take someone when I get lonely, and then I'm not lonely for a while. But they always fade eventually, become just part of the wood. So I need someone new. That's murder. That's preservation. They become eternal, part of something larger than themselves. Isn't that what everyone wants? To matter? To be remembered? Not like this." "You're right," she said, stepping closer. "Not like this. You should join them willingly. Let me show you how beautiful it can be." She reached out and touched my forehead with a finger made of bark. Suddenly, I could hear everything, the voice of every tree in the forest, singing together in harmony. I could feel the network of roots beneath my feet, connecting every plant for miles around. I could sense the slow, deep thoughts of the ancient poplars, remembering centuries of seasons and storms. It was incredible. It was overwhelming. It was everything. "You see?" she whispered. "This is what I can give you. Connection to everything that grows, knowledge of every secret the forest keeps. Love that lasts as long as the mountains themselves." For a moment, I wanted it. God help me, I wanted it. To be part of something so big and old and wise, to never be alone again, to live forever. But then I remembered Dr. Chen's face in the oak tree. Empty eyes, gone thoughts. Whatever this was, it wasn't life. It was just existence. "No," I said, backing away. Ayanna's face twisted with rage. "Then you'll join them the hard way." The trees around the clearing started to move. Their branches reached down like arms, trying to grab me. Roots burst up from the ground, trying to wrap around my legs. The whole forest was turning against me. I ran, behind me. I could hear Ayanna screaming in fury. Trees crashed down, trying to block my path. Thorns grew in walls across the trails. The very ground rolled and shifted under my feet. But I knew these mountains. I'd walked them for 22 years. Even if she could control the trees, she couldn't change the shape of the land itself. I followed the water, found the stream that led down toward the valley, and ran for my life. It took me 3 hours to get out of the grove. 3 hours of running through a forest that was trying to kill me. By the time I reached my truck, I was bleeding, exhausted, and half crazy with fear. But I was out. I was free. I thought it was over. I was wrong. I made it back to the ranger station just after dark, looking like I'd been wrestling with wildcats. Bill took one look at me and wanted to call an ambulance, but I convinced him to sit down and listen instead. I told him everything. The survey team trapped in the trees, the dryad spirit, the faces in the bark. All of it. Bill listened without interrupting, which was more than I expected. "Zeke," he said when I was done, "you've been through something traumatic. Maybe you should see a doctor." "Bill, I need you to believe me. That grove is dangerous. We need to keep people out. I'll file a report about the missing survey team. We'll send in a full search and rescue in the morning." "No," I grabbed his arm. "You can't send people in there. She'll take them too." Bill looked at me like I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Ayanna's face and heard her voice. "You can't leave, Zeke. You belong to the forest now." Around midnight, I gave up on sleep and drove to the Cherokee Nation offices. I needed to talk to someone who might understand what I'd encountered. I found Joseph Crowfeather, an elder who worked as a cultural liaison with the Forest Service. Joseph listened to my story without judgment. When I was finished, he nodded slowly. "Ayanna," he said, "we have stories about her. She was chosen as a guardian in the old days. before the soldiers came. When our people were forced to leave, she stayed behind to protect the sacred grove. But guardians aren't meant to be alone. The solitude drove her mad. She's been taking people, absorbing them into the trees. The stories say she was once kind. She loved deeply and protected fiercely. But when you live too long without human companionship, love can become obsession. Protection can become imprisonment. How do I stop her? Joseph was quiet for a long time. You don't stop her, Zeke. You help her remember who she used to be. What does that mean? She was Cherokee. She had a family, a tribe, a purpose beyond just guarding trees. The madness came from losing all of that. If you could help her remember her humanity. She almost turned me into a tree, Joseph. I'm not going back in there. But you are going back, he said quietly. I can see it in your eyes. You're already planning it. He was right. I couldn't leave those people trapped in the grove. Dr. Chen, Mike, David, Thomas Whitehawk, and God knows how many others. They deserved better than being frozen in wood forever. What was her story? Before she became a guardian, Joseph pulled out an old book of Cherokee legends. Ayanna was young when she was chosen, maybe 18. She had just married a warrior named Sequoia. They were planning to have children, start a family. But the role of guardian required sacrifice. She had to give up her human life to become one with the trees. She loved someone. Yes, and when the soldiers took our people away, they took Sequoia too. She's been waiting for him for over 150 years. I spent the rest of the night reading Cherokee stories and learning about the old rituals. By dawn, I had a plan. It was crazy and dangerous, and would probably breed deaden, get me killed, but it was the only chance I had. I drove back to Joyce Kilmer as the sun was coming up. The grove was different in the morning light, peaceful again, like nothing had happened. But I could see the faces in the trees now. Once you knew how to look. Dozens of them, trapped in bark and wood. I walked to the center of the grove, to the great poplar where Ayanna lived. I came back, I called out. Her face appeared in the bark almost immediately. I knew you would. You can't stay away. None of them ever can. I want to make a deal. No deal, Zeke. You're mine now. Hear me out. I learned about you last night. Your real story. About Sequoia. The face in the tree went very still. I know you're waiting for him. I know that's why you're so lonely. But Sequoia is dead, Ayanna. He died on the Trail of Tears more than a century ago. No. Her voice was small now, like a child's. He said he'd come back for me. He tried. But he couldn't. And all these years, you've been trying to replace him with other people. But they're not him, and they never will be. Ayanna's form began to appear outside the tree, growing from the bark like a flower blooming. But she looked different now. Smaller. More human. I can feel him sometimes, she whispered. In the dreams. He's calling for me. Then go to him. I can't leave the grove. I'm bound here. I gave my life to protect these trees. The trees don't need protecting anymore. They're part of a national forest now. They're safe forever. But if I leave, the grove will still be here. The trees will remember you. But the people you've taken, they deserve to go home. Ayanna looked around at the faces in the trees. For the first time, I saw regret in her expression. I was so lonely, she said. I just wanted someone to stay with me. I know, but keeping people prisoner isn't love. It's just fear. She was quiet for a long time. Then, slowly, she began to sing. The same lullaby I'd heard that first night, but different now. Sadder, but also more beautiful. As she sang, the faces in the trees began to fade. One by one, the trapped people simply dissolved out of the bark and fell to the ground. Alive, breathing, but unconscious. Dr. Chen was first, then Mike and David from the survey team, then Thomas Whitehawk and dozens of others I didn't recognize. Hikers, hunters, researchers who disappeared over the years. Will you be all right? I asked Ayanna. She was becoming transparent now, like morning mist. I should have done this long ago. Thank you for helping me remember. Where will you go? To find him, to find peace. She smiled one last time. Take care of my trees, Zeke. Then she was gone, fading away like smoke in the wind. The official report said the survey team had suffered from exposure to hallucinogenic spores from a rare fungus, mass hysteria, brought on by dehydration and stress. It explained why they'd all been found unconscious in the grove, and why none of them had clear memories of what happened. I didn't argue with the official story. Who would believe the truth? Dr. Chen and her team recovered fully and went back to their university. Thomas Whitehawk returned to his family 5 years after they'd given him up for dead. The other victims, some who'd been missing for decades, went home to whatever families they had left. I stayed on as the ranger for Joyce Kilmer. Someone needed to watch over Ayanna's grove to make sure it stayed protected. The Cherokee Nation worked with the Forest Service to have it designated as a sacred site. No logging, no development, no hunting, just protection. The big poplar still stands in the center of the grove. Sometimes, when the wind is just right, you can hear singing coming from its branches. Not sad anymore, but peaceful. Like a lullaby sung by someone who's finally found rest, Joseph Crow. Feather visits sometimes. He brings offerings, tobacco and sage, and says prayers for Ayanna's spirit. He tells me the grove feels different now. Lighter. Free. I've learned things about trees that no forestry school ever taught. They're connected to each other in ways we're just beginning to understand. They communicate, they care for their young, they remember. And sometimes, in the very old groves, they hold on to more than just memories. There are other places like Joyce Kilmer in these mountains, old-growth forests where the trees have been standing since before the Cherokee, since before any humans at all. Places where the line between the natural and supernatural gets thin. I check on them now, these ancient groves. I make sure they're protected, respected, and I listen. Because once you learn to hear the trees talking, you can never quite tune them out again. Most of the time, they're just sharing news. Which animals are nesting where, when the seasons are. Changing, where the soil is rich and where it's poor. Tree gossip, you might say. But sometimes, in the deepest woods, in the oldest groves, they share other things. Warnings about people who mean harm. Stories about the old days, when the world was younger. And occasionally, very rarely, calls for help. Last month, I got a report about hikers going missing in the Pisgah National Forest. 3 college kids who went camping and never came home. Their camp was found empty, their gear scattered around a grove of ancient hemlocks. I'm heading down there next week to take a look. Just to be sure. Because Ayanna might be gone, but she wasn't the only guardian the Cherokee left behind in these mountains. And after more than a century of solitude, some of them might be getting lonely too. The forest remembers everything. The Cherokee knew that. They knew some memories are best left sleeping. That sometimes, when people forget to show respect, when they forget that some places are sacred, those memories wake up. And they're not always as reasonable as Ayanna turned out to be. My name is Ezekiel Crenshaw, and I've spent 24 years walking through the forests of Tennessee. I know trees, and now I know some of the things that live in them too. If you ever find yourself hiking an old-growth forest, remember to show respect. Listen to the trees, pay attention to the warnings, and if you hear singing coming from somewhere you can't see, maybe it's better to find a different trail. The ancient groves are beautiful places, full of wonder and mystery. But some of them are also graveyards, filled with the spirits of people who loved these mountains so much they could never leave, even when they should have. My name is Luther Foxworth, and I've been a federal ranger in these North Carolina mountains for 16 years. Before that, I spent 8 years with the ATF, chasing down illegal stills and gun runners. I thought I'd seen every trick in the book when it came to moonshine operations. I was wrong. It was September 1979, and the leaves were just starting to turn on Grandfather Mountain. The air had that crisp bite that made you want to build a fire and tell stories. But I wasn't thinking about stories that night when I got the call from Sheriff Davis down in Boone. "Luther, we got a problem," he said, his voice crackling through my radio. "Found some moonshine at Murphy's Bar that's got everybody talking. Quality like nothing I've ever seen." Now, I'd tasted plenty of mountain liquor in my line of work. Most of it could strip paint. But Davis was sending me a sample, and he sounded worried. "What's got you spooked, Sheriff?" "Just taste it when you get it." And Luther, the boys who brought it in, said it came from Hell's Hollow. I knew that place. Deep valley up near the Tennessee line, accessible only by a treacherous goat path that most folks wouldn't attempt even in daylight. My grandfather used to tell stories about that hollow, but I'd always figured they were just mountain tales meant to keep kids from wandering off. The sample arrived the next morning. I opened the mason jar and took a careful sniff. Clean? Too clean. Most mountain liquor smelled like it had been filtered through dirty socks and regret. This stuff smelled like, well, like nothing. Pure as spring water. I touched it to my lips. Smooth as silk, no burn, no aftertaste. It was perfect. Impossibly perfect. That's when I should have known something was wrong. I'd been tracking illegal stills since before most of these mountain boys were born. My daddy was a revenue agent, and his daddy before him fought moonshiners during Prohibition. The Foxworth family had been chasing mountain liquor for 3 generations. I knew every trick, every hiding spot, every family that had been in the business for decades. But I'd never seen anything like this. I loaded up my Jeep with the usual gear, radio, camera, sample bottles, handcuffs. Standard procedure for investigating an illegal operation. The drive to Hell's Hollow took 2 hours on winding mountain roads that hadn't been paved since Roosevelt was president. The hollow sat at the end of a dirt track that petered out into nothing. I parked and hiked the rest of the way, following an old deer trail that wound down through thick stands of pine and oak. The air grew cooler as I descended, and a thin mist hung between the trees like spider webs. I'd been here once before, years ago, following up on reports of a still. Found nothing but old foundations and rusted equipment that looked like it dated back to the 1920 seconds. The local folks claimed the place was cursed. Said anybody who tried to make liquor there met a bad end. Mountain superstition, I'd figured. These people had been telling ghost stories to keep outsiders away from their business for generations. The path ended at a natural clearing where 3 old logging roads came together. A crossroads. In the center, somebody had placed a ring of stones around what looked like the remains of an old campfire. The stones were blackened, and the ground inside the circle was bare dirt, despite the thick grass everywhere else. I knelt down and touched the dirt. It was warm. That was my first real hint that something was off. The temperature had dropped to maybe 50 degrees, but this dirt felt like it was sitting in summer sunshine. I pulled out my thermometer and took a reading. 78 degrees. I made a note in my logbook and started looking around for signs of recent activity. That's when I heard it, faint music drifting through the trees. Fiddle music, the kind of old-time mountain sound you might hear at a church, social, or a barn dance. I followed the sound deeper into the hollow, past moss-covered rocks, and through stands of rhododendron that blocked out most of the afternoon light. The music got clearer as I walked, and I could make out the tune, "The Devil Went Down to Georgia," though it sounded different somehow. Older, meaner. The trail opened up into a wider valley, with a small creek running through the middle. On the far side, tucked back against a limestone cliff, I saw the still, and that's where everything I thought I knew about moonshine operations went straight to hell. The still was old. Not just old. Ancient. Copper kettles green with age, wooden barrels that looked like they'd been there since before the Civil War, and a stone furnace that belonged in a museum. But smoke was rising from the firebox, and I could hear the steady drip, drip, drip of fresh liquor coming off the condenser. Nobody was around. I'd been tracking illegal operations for 24 years, and I'd never seen one running without somebody tending it. Moonshine isn't something you can just set and forget. The temperature has to be perfect, the flow rate has to be adjusted constantly, and somebody has to watch for revenuers like me. I approached slowly, hand resting on my service weapon out of habit. The whole setup looked like something out of a history book, but everything was working perfectly. Too perfectly. The copper gleamed like it had been polished yesterday, and the wood showed no signs of rot or weather damage despite being exposed to the elements. I pulled out my camera and started taking pictures. Through the viewfinder, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a man standing next to the still. I lowered the camera. Nobody there. Raised it again. The man was back, wearing a dark suit that looked like it belonged in the 1920 seconds. Tall, thin, with his back to me. I blinked hard and looked again with my naked eyes. empty clearing. My hands were shaking as I took more pictures. Every single frame showed the man in the suit, but I couldn't see him without the camera. I'd heard of old-timers claiming cameras could capture spirits, but I'd always figured that was just more mountain nonsense. The fiddle music was getting louder. I walked over to the still and examined the setup more closely. The mash bill was written on a piece of paper tacked to one of the barrels. The handwriting looked familiar, though I couldn't place it. The recipe itself was like nothing I'd ever seen. Ingredients I'd never heard of, measurements that didn't make sense, and at the bottom, a note that made my skin crawl. Payment due at crossroads when moon is full. L.F. Luther Foxworth. My initials. But I'd never been to this hollow before today, and I sure as hell had never written any moonshine recipes. I tore the paper off the barrel and stuffed it in my pocket, my mind racing. Maybe another L. F. Maybe a coincidence. Maybe somebody playing a sick joke. I tried my radio to call in the discovery, but all I got was static mixed with that damned fiddle music. The sound was coming through the speaker now, tinny and distorted, but unmistakably the same tune I'd been hearing since I entered the hollow. A stick snapped behind me. I spun around, drawing my weapon. A man stood at the edge of the clearing, and this time I could see him clear as day. Tall, maybe 6.5 feet, wearing that same dark suit I'd seen in the camera. His face was hidden in shadow despite the afternoon sun, and he stood perfectly still. "Federal agent?" I called out. "This is an illegal operation. You need to step forward slowly with your hands visible." The man didn't move, didn't respond, just stood there like a statue. I said, "Step forward, now." That's when he smiled. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I could see that smile. Too wide, too many teeth. "You're early, Luther," he said, and his voice carried across the clearing like it was coming from right next to my ear. "The payment isn't due until the full moon." I'd never told him my name. "Who are you?" I demanded, keeping my gun trained on him. "How do you know who I am?" "Oh, I know all about the Foxworth family," he said, taking a step forward. "Your grandfather and I did business together. Good business. Profitable business. My grandfather's been dead for 15 years. Has he now?" The man took another step closer, and I could see his eyes for the first time. They glowed like coals in a fire. "Time moves differently down here in the hollow, Luther. Past and present tend to overlap. I should have arrested him. Should have called for backup. Should have done a dozen things that made sense according to my training and experience. Instead, I just stood there with my gun pointed at something that was starting to look less and less human with every passing second. "You wanna know about your grandfather's business arrangements?" the man asked. "Look around you. This whole operation was his idea, his recipe, his, shall we say, unique approach to quality control." The pieces of paper in my pocket felt like they were burning a hole through my uniform. L. F. But not Luther Foxworth. Levi Foxworth. My grandfather. "That's impossible," I said. "He was a God-fearing man, preached at the Baptist church for 30 years. "Oh, he found God eventually," the man said, with another one of those terrible smiles. "But not before he found me. Not before he made certain promises. Certain arrangements." The man raised his hand, and every piece of equipment in the still operation began working faster. The fire roared higher, the mash bubbled more vigorously, and that steady drip of fresh liquor turned into a stream. "You see, Luther, your grandfather wanted to make the best moonshine in these mountains. Wanted it so badly, he was willing to pay any price. And I was happy to help him achieve that goal." "What kind of price?" I asked, though I was pretty sure I didn't want to know the answer. "The usual," he said. "His soul, his firstborn son's soul, his firstborn son's firstborn son's soul. A family tradition, you might say. My father had died in Korea, never married, never had kids. That left me." I backed away from the man, keeping my gun raised, though I was starting to suspect bullets wouldn't do much good. "You're talking about my grandfather like you knew him personally." "Oh, I did more than know him," the man said, walking closer. With each step, he seemed to grow taller, and the shadows around his face got deeper. "We were business partners. Very close business partners. My grandfather never made moonshine. He was a preacher, After our arrangement concluded, yes. Amazing how quickly a man finds religion when he realizes what he's really bargained with. The man gestured toward the still. But before that revelation, he was quite the entrepreneur. Wanted to make liquor so pure, so perfect, that it would put every other distiller in these mountains out of business. I thought about the sample I'd tasted that morning. Perfect. Impossibly perfect. And I delivered exactly what he asked for. The man continued. A recipe that would produce the finest moonshine ever made. All he had to do was pay the price. What price? I asked again. 3 generations of Foxworth souls. Your grandfather, your father, and you. His smile got wider. Your father died before his time came due, which was inconvenient. But that just means the debt falls to you. The air in the hollow was getting colder, and that mist I'd noticed earlier was getting thicker. It was starting to swirl around the man's feet like smoke. You're insane, I said. This is all insane. Is it? He pointed at my pocket. Check that recipe again, Luther. Really look at it. I pulled out the piece of paper with my free hand, keeping my eyes on the man. The handwriting did look familiar. I'd seen it before in old family letters and documents, but it was the date at the bottom that made my blood freeze. September 15th, 1934. Today was September 15th, 1979. Exactly 45 years later. Your grandfather was very specific about the terms, the man said. The debt would come due on the 45th anniversary of our agreement. During the harvest moon, at the crossroads where we first met, I looked up at the sky. The moon was visible even in the daylight, a pale circle hanging above the mountains. Tonight it would be full. Even if any of this was true, I said, I never agreed to anything. You can't hold me responsible for something my grandfather might have done. Oh, but that's where you're wrong, the man said. And now he was close enough that I could see his face clearly. Human-shaped, but wrong in ways I couldn't quite put my finger on. His skin was too pale, his features too sharp, and those eyes definitely weren't human. The contract was very clear. 3 generations of souls, whether they agreed or not. Your grandfather made that choice for all of you. Contracts can be broken, not this one. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a piece of parchment that looked even older than the recipe. Would you like to see the terms? Against my better judgment, I took the document. The writing was in my grandfather's hand, but it was different somehow. Shakir. Desperate. I, Levi Foxworth, being of sound mind and body, do hereby pledge the souls of myself and my bloodline for 3 generations in exchange for the knowledge of perfect distillation. The debt shall be paid in full on the 45th anniversary of this agreement, at the crossroads where this bargain was struck during the harvest moon. **, signed in blood this day, September 15th, 1934. **, Levi Foxworth, Times. At the bottom of the document was another signature, but it wasn't written in any alphabet I recognized. The letters seemed to move and shift when I looked at them directly. Your grandfather was quite specific about the quality he wanted, the man said. Moonshine so pure it would seem supernatural. Liquor that would make men weep with joy and women forget their troubles. And I delivered exactly what he asked for. In exchange for our souls. In exchange for 3 souls, yes. Payment in full tonight at midnight, when the moon reaches its peak. I looked at my watch. 4:30 in the afternoon, 7.5 hours. What happens if I don't show up? The man's laugh was like breaking glass. Oh, you'll show up, Luther. You don't have a choice. The contract binds you here until the debt is paid. You couldn't leave this hollow now if you tried. I turned and ran. I made it maybe 50 yards before something invisible slammed into me like a brick wall. I bounced off, nothing at all, and hit the ground hard, my gun flying out of my hand. When I got up and tried again, the same thing happened. The man was still standing by the still, watching me with amusement. Like I said, he called out, you can't leave. The boundaries of this hollow are sealed until our business is concluded. I retrieved my gun and tried a different direction. Same result. It was like being trapped in an invisible cage. Who are you? I shouted. I think you already know, he replied. Your grandfather certainly figured it out quickly enough. Though by then, of course, it was far too late. The sun was starting to set, and the mist in the hollow was getting thicker. I could still hear that fiddle music, but now it seemed to be coming from everywhere at once, and underneath it, I could swear I heard voices. Singing, crying, pleading. The moonshine operation was just the beginning, the man said, walking toward me again. Your grandfather used the recipe I gave him to build quite an empire. Made more money in 5 years than most people see in a lifetime. But money wasn't what he really wanted. What did he want? Respect. Recognition. To be remembered as the greatest distiller in the history of these mountains. The man smiled again, and he got all of that. The Foxworth name became legendary among moonshiners. Men would travel hundreds of miles just to taste his liquor. Until he found God and quit. Until he realized what the true cost would be. Yes, he tried everything he could think of to break our agreement. Became a preacher, thinking God would protect him. Destroyed all his equipment, burned down his still, even moved away from these mountains for a while. But it didn't work. Contracts are binding, Luther. Especially contracts signed in blood with the proper authorities. The man was close enough now that I could smell him. Sulfur and smoke and something else. Something rotten. The grandfather spent the last 15 years of his life trying to find a way to save you. He continued. Consulted every preacher, every root doctor, every wise woman in 3 states. But there's only one way to break a deal with the devil. Which is? His smile was the most terrifying thing I'd ever seen. You have to outwit him. The sun disappeared behind the mountains, and the hollow plunged into darkness. The only light came from the fire under the still, and those glowing eyes staring at me from across the clearing. Your grandfather was very clever, the man said. Spent years studying contract law, looking for loopholes. He found one, actually, a very small one, but clever enough for his purposes. What loophole? The contract specifies 3 generations of Foxworth souls. Your grandfather, your father, you. The man began walking in a slow circle around me. But it doesn't specify that all 3 souls have to be collected. I didn't understand what he was getting at, but I could tell it was important. Your grandfather discovered that if one generation could outwit me, truly outwit me, not just delay the inevitable, the entire contract would be void. All 3 souls would be freed. How do you outwit the devil? Very carefully. His laugh echoed off the limestone cliffs. Your grandfather tried and failed. Your father never got the chance. That leaves you. And if I fail? Then I collect what's owed to me. 3 souls for the price of 1 recipe. I thought about my grandfather, the God-fearing preacher who'd spent his final years carrying a terrible secret. About my father, who died in Korea without ever knowing what legacy he'd inherited. About myself, trapped in this hollow with something that claimed to be the devil himself. What kind of contest? I asked. The traditional kind, the man said. A fiddle contest. Best tune wins. If you win, the contract is void, and your family is free. If I win, you get 3 souls. Exactly. I stared at him. I can't play the fiddle. Oh, but you can, he said, reaching into his jacket again. This time he pulled out a violin case that definitely hadn't been there before. Your grandfather was quite accomplished. Your father had the gift too, though he never developed it. The talent runs in your blood, Luther. I've never touched a fiddle in my life, haven't you? He opened the case, and I saw the most beautiful instrument I'd ever laid eyes on. The wood seemed to glow with its own inner light, and the strings hummed even though no one was touching them. This belonged to your grandfather. He played it every day until our agreement came due. I looked at the fiddle and felt something stir deep in my memory. Distant recollections of sitting on my grandfather's knee, listening to him play old mountain songs. I'd been very young when he died, but I could remember the sound of his fiddle drifting through the house on quiet evenings. He taught you, the man said, reading my thoughts. When you were just a boy, before he realized what he'd passed on to you. I reached for the instrument, and my fingers found the neck like they'd been born to hold it. The bow felt natural in my other hand. Muscle memory, the man explained. Skills that run deeper than conscious thought. Your grandfather made sure you learned, even if you don't remember. I drew the bow across the strings experimentally. The sound that came out was pure and clear, and somehow familiar. My fingers moved to the fretboard without conscious direction, and I found myself playing a simple melody I hadn't heard in 30 years. "Very good," the man said. "You do remember. This is insane, perhaps, but it's also your only chance." He produced his own fiddle from nowhere, an instrument that looked like it was carved from black wood and strung with silver wire. "Shall we begin?" "Wait," I said. "What are the rules?" "Simple. We each play one song. The best performance wins. No tricks, no supernatural enhancement. Just skill against skill." "How do we determine the winner?" The man smiled. "We'll know." He raised his fiddle and began to play. The music that came from his instrument was beyond anything I'd ever heard. It was "The Devil Went Down to Georgia," but played with such skill and power that it seemed to make the air itself vibrate. The notes hung in the darkness like visible things, and I could see the mist in the hollow swirling in time with the melody. But it wasn't just technically perfect, it was emotionally devastating. The music told a story of pride and fall, of deals made in desperation and prices paid in blood. It spoke of every soul that had ever been tempted by promises of power or wealth or recognition. It was beautiful and terrible and absolutely mesmerizing. When he finished, the silence was deafening. "Your turn," he said. I raised my grandfather's fiddle, and for a moment I felt his presence. Not ghostly or supernatural, deep-eyed, just the memory of his hands guiding mine, his voice teaching me the old songs, his love for the music that had been passed down through generations of mountain folk. I began to play. I didn't choose the song consciously. It just flowed out of the fiddle like water from a spring. Amazing Grace. But not the church version. This was the way my grandfather had played it, with all the ornaments and variations that came from a lifetime of mountain music. Simple and pure and honest. As I played, I thought about my grandfather's struggle. 15 years of guilt and fear and desperate searching for a way to save his family. I thought about my father, dying young in a foreign war without ever knowing the burden he carried. I thought about myself, standing in a haunted hollow at midnight, playing for my soul against the devil himself. But mostly, I thought about love. The love that had driven my grandfather to make his original bargain. The love that had tormented him when he realized the cost. The love that had motivated him to spend his final years searching for a way to break the contract. The music poured out of me like a confession, like a prayer, like a promise to all the Foxworths who had come before and might come after. When I finished, tears were streaming down my face. The man stared at me for a long moment. His eyes were no longer glowing, and his smile had faded. "Technically," he said slowly, "my performance was superior." "Yes," I agreed. "It was. But that's not what this was really about, was it?" He was quiet for a long time. The mist in the hollow began to clear, and I could see stars appearing overhead. "Your grandfather was clever," he finally said. "Very clever indeed." "What did he figure out?" "That the contest was never about skill. It was about why you play." The man looked at his fiddle and then at mine. "I play to demonstrate my power, to show my superiority, to claim what's mine by right of contract." And I played. For love. For family. For the hope that future generations might be free of the burden your grandfather created. He smiled, but this time it wasn't terrible. It was almost sad. Love trumps power, Luther. It always has. Your grandfather knew that when he taught you those songs, he was preparing you for this moment. The contract in my pocket burst into flames and crumbled to ash. "The debt is paid," the man said. "Your family is free. What about you? I'll find other crossroads. Other desperate souls willing to make bargains they don't understand." He picked up his fiddle and began to fade like morning mist. "But I'll remember this night, Luther Foxworth. And I'll remember your grandfather's wisdom." "Wait," I called out. What was his name? His real name? But the man was gone, and I was alone in the hollow with my grandfather's fiddle and the ruins of a still that looked like it had been abandoned for decades. I hiked out of Hell's Hollow as the sun was coming up, carrying the fiddle case and a head full of memories I wasn't sure I believed myself. When I reached my Jeep, the radio crackled to life. "Luther, you copy?" Sheriff Davis's voice was worried. "You never checked in last night." "I'm here, Sheriff. Found the still, but it's been abandoned for years. Nothing but old equipment and rust. You find anything that explains the quality of that moonshine? I looked back toward the hollow, where morning mist was rising from the valley floor like smoke from an extinguished fire. Just mountain folklore, I said. Old recipes and older stories. I filed my report that afternoon, documenting an abandoned, still operation with no current activity. The photographs I'd taken showed nothing but empty equipment and morning shadows. The man in the suit was nowhere to be seen. But I kept my grandfather's fiddle. That evening, I sat on my front porch and played some of the old songs he'd taught me. The music came easier now, like a door in my mind had been unlocked. Neighbors stopped to listen, and before long, I had a small audience of folks who remembered Levi Foxworth's playing from their childhood. Your granddaddy was the finest fiddle player in these mountains, old Mrs. Henderson told me. Could make that instrument sing like angels or cry like widows. We sure missed his music when he put it aside. Why did he stop playing? I asked. She looked at me strangely. Don't you know? He said the music was calling him down paths he didn't want to walk. Found God instead, and never picked up that fiddle again. I played until well past midnight, and when I finally went inside, I could swear I heard other fiddles echoing from hollows throughout the mountains. Good music, clean music. Music played for love instead of power. 3 weeks later, I got a letter from the State Historical Society. They wanted to interview me about my grandfather's moonshine recipes, which had become legendary among collectors of Appalachian folklore. Apparently, several old-timers had mentioned that Levi Foxworth made the finest liquor ever produced in the mountains. I told them I didn't know anything about that, but sometimes, late at night when the moon is full and the mist hangs low in the valleys, I take my grandfather's fiddle out to the crossroads near my house and play the old songs. Just in case some desperate soul is thinking about making a bargain they might regret. The devil went down to Georgia, the song says, looking for a soul to steal. But he's been up and down these North Carolina mountains for a lot longer than that. And he'll keep coming back as long as people are willing to trade their souls for earthly desires. The thing about deals with the devil is that the price is always higher than you think you're paying. My grandfather learned that lesson the hard way, but he also learned that love is stronger than any contract, and that wisdom passed down through generations can light the way out of even the darkest hollow. I still patrol these mountains, still chase down illegal stills, still uphold federal law in places where law and order sometimes take a back seat to older traditions. But now I carry more than just a badge and a gun. I carry the memory of a man who made a terrible mistake and spent the rest of his life trying to make it right. And sometimes, on nights when the wind carries the sound of fiddle music from empty hollows, I know he succeeded. If you ever find yourself at a mountain crossroads during a full moon and a well-dressed stranger offers you your heart's desire in exchange for a simple signature, remember the Foxworth family story. Some bargains aren't worth making, no matter how perfect the promised outcome. And if you absolutely must make a deal with the devil, make sure you know how to play the fiddle. You might need it more than you think. My name is Jeremiah Colson, and I've been a park ranger for 14 years. Most people think that means I just hand out maps and tell folks not to feed the bears. But here in Jefferson National Forest, I do something different. I protect old places, archaeological sites, Native American grounds, settlements that time forgot, places where history sleeps. I have a degree in anthropology, which is a fancy way of saying I study how people used to live. My job is to make sure nobody disturbs these places and to document what we find before it disappears forever. The mountains of Virginia hold a lot of secrets. Growing up around here, you hear stories. Old-timers talk about the Melungeons, mixed-race folks who lived in these hills back in the 1700s and 1800s. Nobody knows exactly where they came from. Some say they were descendants of lost Spanish explorers. Others claim they were escaped slaves who mixed with Native Americans and poor whites. What everyone agrees on is that they faced a lot of hatred because people couldn't figure out what race they were. The old folks also tell stories about music in these mountains. They say certain songs have power, that some melodies can call spirits, or wake the dead, or make you remember things that happened long before you were born. I always figured this was just folklore, the kind of stories people tell around campfires to spook each other. Music is just entertainment, right? Sound waves hitting your eardrums. Nothing magical about it. That's what I thought until November 1981, when I heard the massacre victims sing. It started with a call from the main office. Some hikers had reported hearing orchestra music coming from a valley near Mount Rogers. Not just any music. They said it sounded like a full choir and string section, performing complex harmonies. The problem was, this valley was completely uninhabited. No roads led to it. You could only reach it on foot, hiking through thick forest for 3 miles. Probably just kids with a boombox, my supervisor said. But we should check it out. Make sure nobody's camping illegally or disturbing anything important. The valley in question was called Goins Hollow on the old maps, though most people had forgotten the name. It sat in a natural bowl between 3 ridges, hidden from view unless you knew exactly where to look. I'd been there once before, years earlier, doing a routine survey. All I'd found were some scattered foundation stones and what looked like old field boundaries. Nothing remarkable. But as I prepared for the hike, I did some research at the local historical society. What I found made me pay more attention to this trip. According to a document from 1794, Goins Hollow had been home to a small community of Melungeons. About 30 families lived there, farming the bottomland and keeping to themselves. The settlement was led by a man named Jacob Goins and his daughter Sarah, who was described as a woman of remarkable musical talent who led the community's worship and celebrations. Then, in the winter of 1794, the entire settlement vanished. The official record claimed they had simply moved on, seeking better farmland elsewhere. But I found a letter in the Historical Society's files, a letter that had never been made public. It was written by a traveling preacher who had visited Goins Hollow in spring of 1795, looking for the community he'd heard about. "I found the valley empty," he wrote, "but the Lord preserved me from what I discovered there." The cabins stood empty but undisturbed, as if their inhabitants had simply walked away from their evening meals. In the fields, I found signs of a great struggle. The earth disturbed and stained dark, and in a low place near the creek, the ground was soft and yielded beneath my feet, as if it had been recently turned. I fear some great violence occurred here, and these poor souls received no Christian burial. The preacher's letter was dated April 15th, 1795. 5 months after the settlement had supposedly departed for better lands. Now, as I packed my gear for the hike to investigate these reports of music, I couldn't get that letter out of my head. What had really happened to the people of Goins Hollow? And why, after nearly 200 years, were hikers hearing orchestra music from that empty valley? The temperature was dropping fast as I started up the trail. It was the first week of November, and the leaves were gone from most of the trees. The bare branches clicked together in the wind like bones. By the time I reached the ridge overlooking Goins Hollow, the sun was getting low. I stood at the edge and looked down into the valley. It was exactly as I remembered, a bowl of land maybe half a mile across, with a creek running through the middle. The foundation stones were still visible, scattered among the grass like broken teeth. Everything was quiet except for the wind. Then I heard it. Faint at first, I thought it might be the wind playing tricks. But as I listened, it became clearer. Voices, many voices, singing in harmony. The melody was unlike anything I'd ever heard. Complex, haunting, with intervals that seemed to pull at something deep in my chest. I stood frozen, listening. The music seemed to rise from the valley itself, as if the earth was singing. And though I couldn't understand the words, the emotion was unmistakable. These were voices full of sorrow, loss, and desperate longing. The song lasted maybe 3 minutes. Then it faded away, leaving only the sound of wind through bare branches. I made camp on the ridge that night, but I didn't sleep much, because every few hours the singing would start again, and each time it seemed to be calling to me. The next morning, I hiked down into the valley. The singing had stopped before dawn, and now everything was quiet except for my boots crunching through frost-covered grass. In daylight, Goins Hollow looked peaceful, Nato, just an empty meadow with some old stone foundations and a creek bubbling along the eastern edge. I set up a proper archaeological survey, laying out a grid with stakes and string, standard procedure when investigating a historical site. If there really had been a settlement here, I needed to document everything properly before determining what, if anything, needed protection. The foundation stones were more extensive than I'd remembered. As I mapped them out, a pattern emerged. This hadn't been just a few scattered cabins. I was looking at the remains of a real community. I have maybe 20 buildings arranged around a central common area. One foundation was larger than the others, probably a community building or church. Near the creek, I found what looked like a small cemetery. The wooden grave markers had rotted away long ago, but I could see depressions in the earth where bodies had been buried. I counted at least 15 graves, maybe more. But here's the thing that bothered me. If this was a cemetery, where were the headstones? Even poor communities usually marked their graves with something permanent. Carved stones, iron crosses, anything to remember the dead. This cemetery had nothing. I was measuring the cemetery plot when I found the first instrument. It was lying on the ground near the largest grave depression, CSB, a fiddle, still in its case. The case was made of wood and leather, crafted in a style I recognized from museum pieces dating to the late 1700s. But this fiddle looked brand new. The varnish gleamed like it had just been applied. The strings were perfectly tuned. I stared at it for a long time. How does a 200-year-old fiddle end up in perfect condition, lying on the ground in an abandoned cemetery? I photographed it from every angle, then carefully lifted it from its case. The moment my fingers touched the strings, a single note rang out across the valley, clear, sweet, and impossibly sad. The bull note seemed to hang in the air far longer than it should have, echoing off the ridges like a voice calling from far away. That's when I noticed my tape recorder was running. I always record my archaeological work for documentation. But when I played back the tape later, I discovered something strange. The recording captured sounds that I hadn't heard while I was there. Whispered voices speaking in what sounded like an archaic dialect, the rustle of clothing, the soft sound of many people breathing, and underneath it all, very faintly, was the sound of someone crying. I spent the rest of the day surveying the site, but I kept finding things that shouldn't have been there. A wooden flute, carved with intricate designs, sitting on one of the foundation stones. Sheet music, written on handmade paper, covered with musical notation in a style I'd never seen before. A small drum with symbols painted on the hide that didn't match any Native American or European traditions I knew. All of these instruments were old, at least 200 years old, judging by their construction, but they were all in perfect condition, as if they'd been made yesterday and carefully preserved. As evening approached, I made camp on a level spot near the central common area. I'd brought a portable camp stove, sleeping bag, and enough food for 3 days. Part of me wanted to leave, to hike back to my truck and report this as a routine archaeological site. But the historian in me was fascinated. These instruments were an incredible find, possibly the most important collection of 18th century Appalachian folk instruments ever discovered. And there was something else, something I couldn't quite name. The valley felt inhabited, not by living people but by presence, by memory, by stories that needed to be told. I was cooking dinner when the music started again. This time it was closer, much closer. The voices seemed to be coming from the foundation stones around me, a grassed, full choir singing in 4-part harmony. The melody was different from what I'd heard the night before, but equally complex. And now I could make out some of the words. They were singing in English, but in an old dialect that was hard to follow. Something about a journey and a new home and being called to the final gathering. The harmonies were so perfect, so precisely tuned, that they seemed to create new notes in the spaces between voices. I grabbed my tape recorder and held it up, trying to capture everything. But as I did, the singing gradually got louder and closer, as if the singers were walking toward my campfire from all directions. But I couldn't see anyone. The music continued for almost 20 minutes. Sometimes it was just the choir, but other times I could hear the instruments I'd found, the fiddle, the flute, the drum, all playing together in arrangements that were impossibly sophisticated for a backwoods settlement. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the music stopped. The silence that followed was deeper than any quiet I'd ever experienced. No wind, no night insects, no distant traffic. Nothing but the sound of my own breathing and the racing of my heart. I barely slept that night. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear whispers. Voices talking softly in the darkness, too quiet to make out words but loud enough to keep me awake. When I got up to check my surroundings with a flashlight, I found more instruments scattered around my camp: a dulcimer, a wooden whistle, a set of small bells that chimed softly in the breeze. By morning, I had collected 17 different musical instruments, all handcrafted in the style of the late 1700s, all in perfect condition. And I was beginning to understand that something impossible was happening in Goins Hollow. Something that would challenge everything I thought I knew about death, memory, and the power of music to preserve the past. On my second full day in .T8, the valley, I decided to focus on the largest foundation, IND, what I'd identified as the community building. If the people of Goins Hollow had gathered anywhere to make music, it would have been there. The foundation was rectangular, about 30 feet by 20 feet, built from carefully fitted field stones. As I cleared away centuries of fallen leaves and soil, I found something remarkable. The building had burned. The stones were blackened with soot, and I discovered charcoal and ash buried in what would have been the building's interior. But this wasn't an accidental fire. Mixed in with the ash, I found melted metal, buckles, buttons, and other personal items that had been caught in extremely high heat. The kind of heat that comes from an intentional blaze, fed by oil or other accelerants. Someone had burned this building on purpose. And from the amount of personal items in the ash, people had been inside when it happened. I was photographing the burn evidence when I heard footsteps. Clear, deliberate footsteps walking across the wooden floor that no longer existed. I looked up, and for just a moment, I saw her. A young black woman in a long dress from the 1700s, walking through the space where the building had been. She was carrying something in her arms. A baby, I thought, wrapped in a blanket. Her face was turned away from me, but I could see that her dress was torn and stained with something dark. Then she was gone. I sat there shaking, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. Heat mirages, tired eyes, too much coffee, and too little sleep. But my tape recorder had been running, and when I played it back, I heard something that made my blood go cold. Along with the sound of my own breathing and the rustle of leaves, the recording captured the clear sound of a woman humming a lullaby, and underneath that, very faintly, the sound of a baby crying. That afternoon, I drove back to town and spent hours at the Historical Society, digging through every document I could find about Goins Hollow. What I discovered made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. In December 1794, a local militia had been formed to deal with the problem of the mixed-race settlement. The militia was led by a man named Colonel William Hayes, who owned a plantation about 10 miles from Goins Hollow. In his letters to the Virginia governor, Hayes described the Melungeon community as a threat to the natural order and an example that might encourage slave rebellion. On December 21st, 1794, 1809, the winter solstice, the longest night of the year, Hayes and 30 armed men had ridden to Goins Hollow. According to Hayes's own report, they intended to relocate the inhabitants to more appropriate territories. But I found another document, a diary kept by one of Hayes's men, a farmer named Thomas Wright. Wright's account was very different from the official report. According to Wright, the militia had arrived at Goins Hollow during the community's winter solstice celebration. The entire settlement was gathered in their meeting house, singing traditional songs. When Hayes demanded they leave immediately, the community's leader, Jacob Goins, had tried to negotiate. He'd offered to move the settlement in spring, when travel would be safer and they could properly prepare. Hayes had refused. When the Melungeons retreated into their meeting house and barred the doors, Hayes ordered his men to set fire to the building. Wright wrote, "Colonel Hayes said they would come out or burn." But they did not come out. They stayed inside and sang as the flames grew. Such singing I never heard. Not Christian hymns, but something older, sadder, like the earth itself was mourning. Even when the roof collapsed, we could still hear them singing. God forgive us all. 37 people died that night. Men, women, children, babies. Their bodies were thrown into a mass grave by the creek and covered with lime to speed. Decomposition. No markers were placed. No records were kept. The official report stated that the settlement had voluntarily relocated to territories west of the mountains. For nearly 200 years, no one had known the truth about what happened to the people of Goins Hollow. No one except the dead themselves. When I returned to the valley that evening, everything had changed. The instruments I'd found were now arranged in a careful circle around the ruins of the meeting house. As the sun set, I could hear voices gathering, not just the choir I'd heard before, but individual voices calling to each other across the valley. "Sarah? Sarah, where are you? Mama, I can't find Mama. The fire's too hot, Jacob. We can't get out." As full darkness fell, the entire scene began to replay itself. I saw them first as flickering shapes in the firelight. Dozens of people in 18th century clothing gathered in the space where the meeting house had stood. They were singing, just as they had on that terrible night in 1794. But now I could see their faces, and I understood why they had never found peace. These weren't just ghosts. They were the memories of injustice, preserved in melody and harmony. They were the voices of people who had died without anyone knowing their names, their stories, their songs. They had been singing in this valley for 2 centuries, waiting for someone to hear them, someone to remember them, someone to tell the world what had really happened here. And for some reason, they had chosen me. As the phantom fire grew brighter around the ruins, a woman stepped forward from the group. She was young, maybe 25, with dark skin and long black hair. She wore a dress that had once been white but was now stained with soot and blood. In her arms, she cradled a baby that flickered between life and death like a candle flame. When she spoke, her voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Are you the one who will sing our songs to the living?" Her name was Sarah Goins, daughter of Jacob, leader of the community's music and keeper of their songs. As she spoke, the other spirits gathered around us in a circle, their faces lit by the phantom fire that had killed them all those years ago. "We have been waiting," Sarah said, her voice carrying the weight of 2 centuries. "Waiting for someone who would listen, someone who would understand that our songs carry more than melody, they carry truth." The baby in her arms looked at me with eyes that held impossible sadness. This was her child, I realized, born into a community that was trying to find its place in a hostile world, killed before he could speak his first words. "You're historians," I said, my voice barely working. "You're trying to preserve what happened here." Sarah nodded. "Music is memory, Jeremiah Colson. In our songs, we kept the stories of our people, where we came from, how we lived, what we believed. When they burned us alive, our songs were burning too. All that history, all that culture, turning to ash." Around the circle, other spirits began to sing. But these weren't the complex harmonies I'd heard before. These were individual songs, lullabies, work songs, wedding songs, funeral songs, each one carrying the story of a life lived and lost. An elderly man sang about crossing the ocean from a land he could barely remember. A young woman sang about falling in love with a Cherokee man and creating a family that belonged to multiple worlds. A child sang about learning to play the fiddle from his grandmother, who had learned it from her grandmother, stretching back through generations of musical tradition. As each person sang their story, I felt their memories flowing into me. I saw their lives, the joy, the struggle, the love, the fear. I experienced their final night, trapped in the burning meeting house while militiamen stood outside with torches and rifles. But I also felt something else. These spirits weren't just sharing their memories with me, they were teaching me their songs. Each melody was embedding itself in my mind, complete with words, harmonies, and the cultural context that gave it meaning. "This is what we need," Sarah said. "Someone living who can carry our music forward. Someone who can teach these songs to others, so our people will be remembered." "But why me?" I asked. "I'm not a musician. I'm just a park ranger with an anthropology degree." "You listen," Sarah replied. "You care about preserving what was lost, and you understand that some truths can only be told through song." The circle of spirits moved closer, and their singing grew more intense. The melodies began to weave together, creating harmonies that seemed to reshape reality around us. The ruined foundations flickered between past and present. Sometimes I saw the burned stones. Sometimes I saw the buildings as they had been, full of life and warmth, community. But there's a price, Sarah continued, and her voice grew sad. To carry our songs, you must carry our pain. To remember our joy, you must also remember our suffering. And once you begin singing our music, you can never stop. Our songs will become part of you, calling to you, demanding to be shared. I looked around at the spirits surrounding me, 37 people who had died violent deaths, whose stories had been buried with their bodies. For 2 centuries, they had been alone in this valley, singing to empty air, waiting for someone to hear them. What happens to you? I asked. If I agree to this, if I learn your songs and share them with the world, what happens to you? Sarah smiled for the first time since I'd seen her, and for a moment, she looked like any young mother holding her child. We find peace. Our stories become part of the living world again. Instead of trapped in this place of death, we can finally rest. The phantom fire was growing, brighter, and I could feel heat on my face even though I knew it wasn't real. The spirits were becoming more solid, more present. Some part of me understood that I was approaching a point of no return. If I stayed much longer, if I let them teach me all their songs, I might not be able to leave this valley. I might join their eternal chorus, trading my life for their stories. But as I looked at Sarah's face, at the hope and desperation there, I knew I couldn't walk away. These people deserved to be remembered. Their culture deserved to survive. Their music, which carried the voices of Spanish explorers and Cherokee medicine men and African griots and Scottish settlers, all blended into something uniquely American, deserved to be heard again. Teach me, I said. The moment I spoke those words, the spirits rushed toward me like a wind made of memory and melody. I felt their songs pouring into me, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Lullabies and love songs and work songs, and sacred chants. Each one carried the full weight of the life that had created it. I felt like I was drowning in music, in history, in the accumulated pain and beauty of an entire community. The melodies tangled together in my mind, threatening to drive me insane with their complexity. But underneath the chaos, I could hear Sarah's voice, guiding me, teaching me how to hold all these songs without losing myself. Remember, she whispered, and her voice was fading as the phantom fire began to die down. Remember us all. When the fire finally went out, I was alone in the valley. But I was no longer the same person who had arrived 3 days earlier. I could feel the songs inside me, waiting to be sung. I could feel the weight of 37 stories that were now mine to carry forward. And I could still hear Sarah's voice, very faintly, singing a lullaby to her child as they finally found their way to peace. I hiked out of Goins Hollow the next morning, but I carried the valley with me. The songs were always there now, humming just beneath the surface of my consciousness. When I was alone, I found myself singing melodies I'd never learned, in harmonies that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than memory. The first thing I did was contact the Virginia Department of Historic Resources. Within a week, I had a team of archaeologists and historians working with me to properly excavate the site. We found everything I'd expected: Foreman Round, the mass grave, the evidence of the fire, the personal belongings of 37 murdered people. But we also found things that couldn't be explained by conventional archaeology. Musical instruments buried throughout the valley, all in perfect condition despite being underground for 2 centuries. Sheet music written on paper that should have rotted away long ago. And in the ruins of the meeting house, carved into a stone that had been hidden beneath the ash, we found something remarkable. A complete list of the community members, their names and ages, written in Sarah Goins' own hand. The official historical record was corrected. Goins Hollow became a recognized historical site, with markers commemorating the Melungeon community that had lived and died there. The truth about the 1794 massacre was added to Virginia's historical records, and Colonel Hayes's descendants even issued a formal apology. But for me, that was just the beginning. I started teaching the songs, first to local musicians, then to folklorists and ethnomusicologists from universities across the country. Each song I shared seemed to unlock more memories, more melodies. It was as if the act of singing them in the living world was calling forth other lost voices from other forgotten places. Within 5 years, I had documented over 300 songs from the Goins Hollow tradition. I published papers on Melungeon music, recorded albums with traditional musicians, and spoke at conferences about the power of music to preserve cultural memory. I became known as an expert in Appalachian folk traditions that had been thought lost forever. But the work came with a price, just as Sarah had warned. The songs were always with me, demanding to be heard. Sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night with a new melody in my head, a song I'd never heard before but somehow knew completely. Other times, I would be in the middle of a conversation and suddenly find myself humming a lullaby that carried the weight of 2 centuries of sorrow. And I wasn't the only one being affected. Other rangers throughout the Appalachian region began reporting similar experiences. Voices in abandoned valleys, instruments appearing overnight near historical sites, music that seemed to rise from the mountains themselves, carrying stories of communities that had been forgotten, erased, or deliberately destroyed. The mountains, it seemed, were full of songs waiting to be remembered. I still work for the Forest Service, but my job has changed. Now I'm part of a special team that investigates reports of cultural phenomena at historical sites. We've documented voices in Cherokee burial grounds, phantom drums in locations where Civil War battles were fought, and complete orchestral performances in valleys where German settlers were massacred by French raiders in the 1750 seconds. The mountains remember everything. Every people who lived here, loved here, died here, they all left their songs in the stones and soil. And sometimes, when conditions are just right, when someone is listening with the right kind of ears, those songs come back. 3 months ago, I returned to Goins Hollow for the first time since that November in 1981. The historical markers were in place, and the site was being maintained as a memorial. But as I stood in the gathering dusk near the ruins of the meeting house, I realized I could still hear them. Very faintly, barely audible above the wind through the bare. The branches, I could hear the spirits singing. Not the desperate, mournful songs of the unremembered dead, but something new. Songs of gratitude, of peace, of joy at being remembered again. And underneath it all, clear and sweet, I heard Sarah Goins singing a lullaby to her child. Not a song of sorrow anymore, but a song of love that would never end. The dead don't always stay quiet. Sometimes they sing. And if you listen, really listen, you might learn something about the music that lives in the mountains, waiting to be remembered. But be careful. Once you hear the songs of the departed, you can never unhear them. And once you start singing them, you become part of their story forever. Some nights, when the wind is right and the mountains are quiet, I swear I can hear new voices joining the eternal chorus. Voices of people who lived and died in these hills, all adding their songs to the great symphony of memory that echoes through the valleys of Appalachia. And someday, when my time comes, I know my voice will join them too. My name is Prudence Wheelwright, and I've been a park ranger in the George Washington National Forest for 9 years now. Before that, I was a nurse in Richmond for 6 years. I came to these mountains to get away from hospitals and death, but sometimes death follows you wherever you go. People call me Prue. I'm 32 years old, and I specialize in medical emergencies out here in the wilderness. When hikers fall off cliffs or get lost for days, I'm the one who coordinates the helicopter rescues. I know how to set bones, stop bleeding, and keep people alive until we can get them to a real hospital. The Shenandoah Valley is beautiful, especially in late October when the leaves turn red and gold. But there are places in these mountains that feel wrong. The old-timers who've lived here all their lives will tell you stories about certain hollows where bad things happened long ago. They say some places hold on to death like a sponge holds water. I never believed that kind of talk. I'm a medical professional. I believe in germs and viruses, broken bones and blood loss. Real things you can see under a microscope or on an X-ray. But that was before I went to Fever Hollow. The call came in on a Tuesday morning in October of 1986. It was unusually warm for late fall, the kind of sticky heat that makes your shirt cling to your back. Dr. Sarah Chen from Virginia Commonwealth University had been leading a research team studying sites where the 1918 flu pandemic hit hardest. They were camping in a remote hollow about 15 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by hiking trail. One of the researchers had radioed in sick on Monday night. By Tuesday morning, 3 more team members were down with high fevers. Dr. Chen requested immediate medical evacuation. Sounds like regular flu, my supervisor, Tom Bradley, said as he handed me the radio report. But with 4 people sick at once, better safe than sorry. I packed my medical kit, checking my supplies twice: IV fluids, antibiotics, fever reducers, thermometer, blood pressure cuff, everything I might need for flu treatment in the field. I'd done medical evacuations before. This should be routine. The hike into Fever Hollow took 3 hours. The trail was steep and narrow, winding down into a deep valley surrounded by high ridges. About halfway down, I noticed the air getting thicker and warmer. The trees seemed closer together, their branches blocking out most of the sky. I also noticed the smell, sweet and sour at the same time, like flowers rotting in the heat. There were dead animals along the trail: squirrels, birds, a raccoon. All of them looked like they'd just laid down and died. No wounds, no blood. They looked almost peaceful. The valley floor was swampy, with pools of dark water scattered between the trees. Spanish moss hung from the branches, and the ground squelched under my boots. It was the kind of place that stayed damp all year round, where things grew thick and wild. I found the research camp near the center of the hollow. 5 tents arranged in a circle around a fire pit. Dr. Chen met me at the edge of camp, and I could see right away that she was fighting off illness herself. Her face was flushed, and she kept wiping sweat from her forehead. "Thank God you're here," she said. "It hit them so fast. Yesterday they were fine. Today they can barely stand up." I checked the sick researchers one by one. All 4 had the same symptoms: high fever, severe body aches, difficulty breathing, and a strange rash on their necks. Their temperatures were all over 103 degrees, dangerously high. But what bothered me was how identical their symptoms were. When people get the flu, it affects everyone a little differently. Some get more stomach problems, others have worse congestion. These 4 looked like they'd been infected by the exact same strain at the exact same moment. "When did the symptoms start?" I asked Dr. Chen. As I started an IV on the worst patient, a young man named Marcus who was barely conscious. Yesterday evening, we were exploring the old settlement ruins about a quarter-mile from here. There are foundations from houses, a church, even what looks like a small cemetery. She paused to cough. The temperature reading got weird around sunset. "What do you mean, weird?" Our thermometers started showing different readings in different spots. Right here in camp, it's 68 degrees. But near the old settlement, it was reading 89 degrees. We thought the equipment was broken. I checked my own thermometer. In the shade of the tent, it read 70 degrees. I walked 20 feet toward the center of the hollow and checked again, 85 degrees. That didn't make sense. As I worked to stabilize the patients, I noticed other strange things. My IV bags kept developing small tears, leaking fluid even though they were brand new. My stethoscope picked up extra heartbeats that didn't match what I was feeling with my fingers, and the smell, that sweet, rotten smell, seemed to get stronger whenever I got close to the sickest patients. By evening, Dr. Chen was showing the same symptoms as the others. That left me alone in a hollow with 5 critically ill people and no way to get help until morning. The radio couldn't reach through the valley walls, and it would take me 6 hours round trip to hike out for help. I set up my camp stove to boil water and checked everyone's vital signs again. All 5 patients were getting worse, not better, despite the medication I'd given them. Their fevers should have broken by now, but instead they were climbing higher. Around midnight, Marcus started talking in his sleep. At first, it sounded like normal fever delirium, just random words and mumbling. But then I started listening closer. He was talking about someone named Mary, describing how she coughed up blood before she died. He mentioned children crying in the church, and men digging graves in the frozen ground. He talked about the smell of death hanging over the hollow like a fog. The strange thing was, Marcus was only 24 years old, but he was talking like an old man remembering things from long ago. And he knew details about the 1918 flu pandemic that I was pretty sure weren't in any textbook. I checked my watch. 2:17 a.m. My thermometer was now reading 95 degrees, even though I was sitting in the cool night air. Something was very wrong in Fever Hollow, and it wasn't just the flu. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard coughing from the forest around us. Wet, horrible coughing that sounded like someone drowning. But when I shined my flashlight into the trees, nothing was there. By morning, all 5 researchers were unconscious, with fevers over 105 degrees. I'd given them everything I had: IV fluids, antibiotics, fever reducers, but nothing was working. In fact, they seemed to be getting sicker, despite treatment. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Dr. Chen's notebook was lying open next to her tent, and she'd been writing in it during the night. Her handwriting started normal, but as the pages went on, it got shakier and older looking. The last few entries weren't even in her voice. Asterisk. The children went first. Asterisk, one entry read. Asterisk. Little Emma coughed so hard she broke her ribs. Then baby Thomas stopped breathing in the night. By the time the snow melted, we'd lost 47 souls. Had to bury them quick before the sickness spread further. Asterisk. I flipped back through the notebook. Dr. Chen had been researching the 1918 pandemic, looking for evidence of mass graves in the hollow. According to her notes, a small settlement called Haven's Rest had been completely wiped out by the Spanish flu. The survivors had buried the dead in a hurry, marking the graves with whatever stones they could find. The really disturbing part was that Dr. Chen's research showed the settlement had lost 47 people to the flu. The exact number mentioned in the notebook entry she'd written while unconscious. I tried the radio again, but still couldn't get through. The valley walls blocked everything. I was going to have to leave the patients and hike out for help, but that meant leaving 5 dying people alone for at least 6 hours. Before I left, I decided to check the settlement ruins. Dr. Chen had mentioned. Maybe I could find some clue about what was making them so sick. The spot was a quarter-mile through the swamp, following a path that was barely visible between the trees. The ruins weren't much to look at. Foundation stones from maybe a dozen houses, arranged along what used to be a dirt road. Most were overgrown with vines and moss, but you could still see the outline of the old community. At the far end was a larger foundation, probably the church Dr. Chen had mentioned. Near the church, I found the cemetery. Dozens of simple stone markers, most with dates from 1918 and 1919. Some of the stones had names carved deep into them. Emma Cartwright, age 6, taken by the fever. Thomas Miller, infant son, God rest his soul. But what really got my attention were the thermometer readings. Just like Dr. Chen had said, the temperature near the graves was 20 degrees higher than it should be. I could actually feel the heat rising from the ground like it was summer pavement. I knelt down and touched one of the gravestones. It was warm, almost hot, and underneath the stone, I could swear I heard something. A faint sound, like breathing, or maybe coughing. That's when I saw the first one. It was just for a second, out of the corner of my eye. A woman in an old-fashioned dress, standing between 2 graves about 50 feet away. She was pale and thin, and even from a distance I could see that she was coughing into a handkerchief. I turned to look directly at her, and she was gone. Nothing there but Spanish moss hanging from a dead tree. I told myself it was heat exhaustion. The temperature was still climbing, even though it was only 9 in the morning. My shirt was soaked with sweat, and I was starting to feel lightheaded. But then I heard the coughing again. This time it was coming from multiple directions, like an echo that bounced off the valley walls. Wet, painful coughing that seemed to go on forever. I ran back toward camp, splashing through the swamp water and tripping over fallen logs. Behind me, the coughing got louder. It sounded like dozens of people, all coughing at the same time, all struggling to breathe. When I reached camp, I found Marcus sitting up in his tent. His fever had broken, and he was looking around with clear eyes. For a moment I felt relieved. Maybe the crisis was over. "Marcus," I said, kneeling beside him. "How are you feeling?" He looked at me with confusion, like he didn't recognize me. Then he spoke, but it wasn't his voice. It was older, rougher, with a mountain accent I'd never heard from him before. "Who are you, miss?" "I don't know you from the valley. I'm Prudence. I'm a park ranger. You're sick, Marcus. Do you remember being sick?" "Marcus?" He shook his head slowly. "My name's William Cartwright, and I got to check on my Emma. She's been coughing something awful." My hand started shaking as I checked his pulse. It was steady and strong, not like someone who'd been dying of fever an hour ago. But his eyes looked different. older. Like he'd seen things that Marcus, a 24-year-old grad student, had never seen. "William," I said carefully, "what year is it?" 1918, of course. "Why would you ask such a thing?" He started to stand up. "I need to find Emma. The fever's been taking the children first, and I can't lose my little girl." That's when I realized that Marcus, or whoever he thought he was talking about Emma Cartwright, the 6-year-old girl whose grave I'd just seen in the cemetery. I backed away from the tent, my heart pounding. This wasn't possible. People don't just become different people when they have the flu. But as I looked at Marcus, I saw nothing of the young researcher I'd met yesterday. His posture was different, his facial expressions, even the way he moved his hands. The other patients were stirring too. Dr. Chen sat up and looked around with the same confused expression. When she spoke, it was in the voice of an elderly woman. "Have you seen my Thomas?" she asked. "He's just a baby, and this fever's got him so weak." Thomas Miller. The infant, whose grave was right next to Emma's. I stumbled backward toward the edge of camp, watching as all 5 researchers sat up and started talking. But none of them were talking like themselves. They were talking like the people buried in that cemetery. People who had died from the flu 68 years ago. The temperature was still rising. My thermometer now read 98 degrees, and the air was so thick it was hard to breathe. The smell of sickness was everywhere. That sweet, rotten smell that reminded me of the hospital rooms where people went to die. And from the forest around us, the coughing was getting closer. The people who had been my patients were walking around camp now, but they weren't my patients anymore. They were strangers wearing familiar faces, looking for family members who had been dead for almost 70 years. William, who used to be Marcus, was searching through the tents, calling for his daughter Emma. Sarah, who used to be Dr. Chen, was holding one of the sleeping bags like it was a baby, rocking it gently and humming a lullaby I'd never heard before. I tried talking to them, but they looked at me like I was the strange one. To them, I was the outsider in their world. They were living in 1918, in the middle of a flu pandemic that was killing their loved ones. The worst part was watching their bodies. Even though they were up and moving around, I could see the fever symptoms getting worse. Their skin was flushed and burning hot. They were coughing more frequently, and some of them were starting to cough up blood, but they didn't seem to notice their own sickness. They were too worried about finding their dead family members. I grabbed my radio and hiked up the ridge, trying to get high enough to reach someone. Finally, at about 1,000 feet above the valley floor, I got through to Tom Bradley. "Tom, I need immediate medical evacuation for 5 patients," I said. "And I need a hazmat team." "Hazmat? Prue, what's going on down there?" I didn't know how to explain it without sounding crazy. The researchers are showing symptoms of Spanish flu, the 1918 strain, and Tom, their behavior is completely altered. I think we're dealing with some kind of biological agent that affects the brain. Spanish flu? Prue, that's impossible. That strain has been extinct for decades. I know how it sounds, but I'm looking at symptoms that match historical descriptions exactly. High fever, bloody cough, rapid progression, and the temperature readings in this valley are all wrong. It's 20 degrees hotter than it should be. There was a long pause. "All right, I'm calling in a CDC team and a helicopter, but it's going to take them at least 6 hours to get a hazmat crew together." 6 hours. I looked down at the camp below, where 5 people were slowly dying of a disease that shouldn't exist anymore. 6 hours might be too long. When I got back to camp, things had gotten worse. The 5 researchers were now coughing up significant amounts of blood, but they were still walking around looking for their 1918 families. They'd also started singing old hymns and folk songs that I was pretty sure none of them had known yesterday. And the temperature was still rising. It was now 102 degrees in the shade, hot enough that my medical equipment was starting to malfunction. The plastic on my IV bags was getting soft, and my electronic thermometer was giving error messages. That's when I noticed the new graves. They weren't there when I'd hiked up the ridge. But now, in the cemetery area, there were 5 fresh mounds of dirt with makeshift wooden crosses. And carved into the crosses were names: Marcus Williams, Sarah Chen, Jennifer Walsh, David Kim, Robert Torres. The names of my patients. I ran back to camp, my heart pounding. The 5 researchers were still there, still walking around in their 1918 personalities. But somehow, somewhere else, graves had been dug for their real selves. "We need to leave," I told them. "All of you, right now. We're hiking out of this valley." But they wouldn't listen. To them, I was a stranger suggesting they abandon their families during a medical crisis. Marcus actually got angry with me. "I can't leave Emma," he said. "She's just a little girl, and the fever's got her bad." "What kind of father would I be?" "Emma's not here," I said. "She died in 1918. You're Marcus Williams, you're a graduate student, and you're very sick." He looked at me with pity, like I was the one who was confused. "Miss, I think the heat's getting to you. Maybe you should sit down." That's when I heard the voices from the forest. At first it sounded like wind through the trees, but as I listened closer, I could make out words. Children crying for their mothers, men talking about digging graves, women singing lullabies to babies that would never grow up. The voices of the 1,918 flu victims. I walked toward the edge of camp, following the sound. Through the trees, I could see shapes moving between the Spanish moss. People in old-fashioned clothes, walking slowly through the swamp. Some of them were carrying shovels, others were holding children. They all looked sick, pale, thin, coughing into handkerchiefs that were stained with blood. But they were walking around, talking to each other, acting like they were alive, and they were all walking toward our camp. I grabbed my radio and called Tom again. "The evacuation needs to happen now. Whatever it takes, get a helicopter down here." "Prue, the CDC team isn't ready yet. They need time to prepare for an unknown biological agent." "There's no time," I said. "People are going to die." "People? I thought you said there were only 5 researchers." I looked back toward the camp, where my 5 patients were now greeting the approaching figures from the forest. They were hugging and crying, reuniting with family members they hadn't seen in 68 years. "It's more complicated than I thought," I said. The reunion was heartbreaking to watch. Marcus found his daughter, Emma, a pale little girl who coughed into her hand and left blood on her fingers. Sarah, whoever was rocking a baby that looked real but couldn't possibly be real. But the most disturbing thing was that my patients were getting sicker as they spent time with their 1,918 families. The fever was consuming them from the inside, and I could see them getting weaker by the minute. I tried one more time to convince them to leave with me. But they weren't interested in 1986 or helicopter evacuations or modern medicine. They were exactly where they wanted to be, with the people they loved, in the time they belonged to. The problem was, the 1,918 flu had killed everyone in Haven's Rest, and if my patients stayed here much longer, it was going to kill them too. As the afternoon wore on, more people emerged from the forest. Dozens of them, all showing signs of the flu, all carrying the smell of sickness and death. The temperature climbed past 105 degrees, hot enough that I had to keep moving to avoid heat stroke. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I was starting to understand what was really happening in Fever Hollow. This wasn't just a medical emergency. It was something much stranger and much more dangerous. The 1,918 flu pandemic had left its mark on this place in ways that went beyond just graves and memories. It had left something alive, something hungry, something that wanted to finish what it had started all those years ago. And my patients were helping it do exactly that. By sunset, I was the only person in Fever Hollow who belonged to 1,986. Everyone else, the researchers and the dozens of figures from the forest, was living in 1918. They'd set up what looked like a field hospital near the old church, with people lying on blankets and family members trying to care for them. It would have been touching if it wasn't so terrifying. I could see my 5 patients among the crowd, but they were barely recognizable now. The fever had burned through them like fire, leaving them gaunt and hollow-eyed. They were dying the same death as their 1,918 counterparts, on the same timeline, following the same pattern, and I was starting to feel the fever myself. It started as a warm feeling in my chest, like I'd swallowed hot coffee. Then came the sweating, the dizziness, the ache in my bones that felt like someone had beaten me with a baseball bat. My throat was getting scratchy, and I had to fight the urge to cough. I checked my temperature. 101 degrees and climbing. The really scary part was that along with the physical symptoms, I was starting to remember things that had never happened to me. Images of a hospital ward filled with dying patients, the sound of shovels hitting frozen ground, the weight of a dead child in my arms, memories that belonged to someone else. Someone who had lived through the 1918 pandemic and died from it. I stumbled toward the cemetery, fighting off waves of dizziness and nausea. The sun was setting behind the ridge, and in the growing darkness, the warm glow from the graves was more visible. Each stone marker was giving off light and heat, like they had fires burning underneath them. Near the center of the cemetery, I found what I was looking for, a larger stone that marked a mass grave. Here lie 47 souls taken by the fever, October 1918. May God grant them rest. The stone was so hot I could barely touch it, and underneath, I could hear something moving, breathing, whispering, maybe crying. That's when I saw her. She was standing on the other side of the mass grave, wearing a nurse's uniform from the 1910 seconds. Her face was pale and drawn, and she had the same hollow-eyed look as all the other flu victims. But unlike the others, she was looking directly at me. "You're not supposed to be here," she said. Her voice sounded like wind through dry leaves. "Neither are you," I managed to say. "You're dead. You all died in 1918. She smiled, but it wasn't a happy expression. Death isn't the end for some of us. The fever keeps us alive, keeps us working. There's always more to do. What do you want? What we've always wanted, to finish our work, to save everyone we can from the sickness." She gestured toward the field hospital, where dozens of people were coughing and dying. We couldn't save them the first time, but now we have another chance. I realized what she meant. The 1918 flu hadn't just killed the people of Haven's Rest. It had trapped their spirits here, bound to the valley by their desperate need to heal the sick and comfort the dying. They'd been reliving the pandemic over and over for 68 years, trying to change an outcome that couldn't be changed. And my research team had given them new bodies to work with, new patients to try to save. "They're not your patients," I said. "They're mine, and they don't belong to 1918. The fever doesn't care what year it is," the nurse said. "Sickness is sickness, death is death, and these people are dying." She was right about that. I could see Marcus William in the field hospital holding the hand of a little girl who was coughing up blood. He was whispering comfort to her, telling her everything would be all right, even as the fever consumed both of them. But I also understood something the nurse didn't. The 1918 flu had killed everyone in Haven's Rest, not because there was no cure, but because they didn't have the right treatment. No antibiotics, no IV fluids, no modern fever management. They'd done the best they could with what they had, but it wasn't enough. I, on the other hand, had 1986 medical knowledge, and maybe that was enough to break the cycle. "I can save them," I told the nurse. "But not here, not while they're trapped in your world. You're just one person. We are 47. We know the sickness better than anyone. You know how to die from it," I said. "I know how to cure it." The confrontation lasted until midnight. The nurse called other spirits to help her. The doctor who had tried to treat the original outbreak, the minister who had given last rites to dying children, the gravedigger who had worked until his hands bled and then died himself. They all wanted the same thing: to replay 1918 until they got it right, to save the people they couldn't save the first time. But I had something they didn't have. I had medical supplies that could actually treat the flu, and I had knowledge about disease progression that could keep people alive long enough for their bodies to fight off the infection. The battle wasn't physical. It was a battle of wills, fought in the strange space between 1918 and 1986, between the world of the dead and the world of the living. I had to convince 5 critically ill people to leave the arms of their 1918 families and trust a stranger with unfamiliar medicine. I had to convince 47 desperate spirits to let go of patients they'd been trying to save for almost 70 years. And I had to do it all while fighting off a fever that was trying to drag me into 1918 alongside everyone else. The key was Marcus. Even in his William identity, some part of him recognized me as a medical professional. When I approached him with an IV bag and told him I could save Emma if he trusted me, he hesitated. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. "Come back to 1986 with me. Bring Emma if you need to, but come back to a time when we have medicine that can help her." It was a crazy thing to ask, but Marcus was a scientist, even buried under the William personality. The logical part of his brain could see that the 1918 treatments weren't working. One by one, I convinced the other researchers to follow me back to camp. Away from the cemetery, away from the glowing graves, away from the field hospital where people had been dying the same death for 68 years. The spirits tried to stop us. The nurse blocked our path. Other flu victims reached out to pull my patients back. The temperature spiked to over 110 degrees, hot enough that the trees around us started wilting. But I kept walking, leading 5 sick people through the swamp toward medical equipment that could actually save them. The helicopter arrived at dawn, just as I was giving the last of my IV antibiotics to Dr. Chen. By then, all 5 researchers had broken their fevers and were back to themselves. Confused, exhausted, and very sick, but themselves again. The CDC team spent 3 days in Fever Hollow, running tests on everything from the soil to the air to the water in the swamp pools. They found traces of the 1918 flu virus in the deep ground layers near the cemetery, preserved in the permafrost like some kind of biological time capsule. "Extraordinary," the lead researcher told me. "The viral material is still genetically active after all these years. We've never seen anything like it." But they couldn't explain the temperature anomalies, or why my patients had developed symptoms so quickly, or why they'd all had the same fever dreams about 1918. The report called it mass psychogenic illness, triggered by exposure to historical flu virus remnants. I didn't bother telling them about the spirits. The valley was declared a biological hazard zone and closed to the public. Signs were posted at all the trailheads warning about contaminated groundwater and unstable soil conditions. Researchers would need special permits to visit, and only with full protective equipment. I requested a transfer to a different section of the forest. Tom Bradley approved it without asking questions, probably because I'd started jumping every time someone coughed near me. But I couldn't stop thinking about what the nurse had said. The fever keeps us alive, keeps us working. There were other places in the Appalachian Mountains where flu outbreaks had hit hard in 1918, other small communities that had been wiped out and hastily buried. Were there other fever hollows? Other places where the dead were still trying to save the living? I started researching historical pandemic sites in my spare time. I found records of similar outbreaks in remote valleys throughout Virginia, West Virginia, and North Carolina. Small settlements that had lost entire populations to the flu. Places where mass graves had been dug in a hurry and then forgotten. 6 months after Fever Hollow, I got a call from a ranger in the Blue Ridge Mountains. A group of historical researchers had developed mysterious fevers while studying an abandoned 1918 settlement. The symptoms were progressing fast, and standard treatment wasn't working. "How soon can you get here?" the ranger asked. I packed my medical kit, checking my supplies twice. Antibiotics, IV fluids, fever reducers, and one new addition, a small bottle of water from a spring in normal living ground. Sometimes you need to remind people which world they belong to. The drive to the Blue Ridge would take 4 hours. I hoped that would be soon enough, because the 1918 flu pandemic left its mark on more places than just Fever Hollow, and some kinds of sickness, I'd learned, go deeper than anything medicine can cure. The dead have their own ideas about healing, and sometimes, if you're not careful, they'll try to heal you to death. As I drove toward the mountains, I rolled down the windows and let the cool October air wash over me. It felt good to be in 1986, breathing 1986 air, heading toward 1986 problems that could be solved with 1986 medicine. But I kept checking my temperature every few miles, just to be sure. Because once you've felt the fever, you never really forget how it burns. And in the deepest mountains of Appalachia, some fires never go out. My name is Tobias Mountain Hawk, and I've been a wildlife enforcement officer for the Chattahoochee National Forest for 25 years. That's a quarter century of tracking poachers, checking hunting licenses, and making sure folks follow the rules when they come into these Georgia mountains. I know every trail, every creek, and every animal sign from here to Brasstown Bald. People always ask about my last name. My grandfather was Cherokee, and he used to tell me stories about the old days when his people hunted these very same mountains. Back then, there were rules about hunting that went way deeper than any law book. Sacred rules. Rules about which animals you could take and which ones you had to leave alone. I always listened politely to those stories, but I'm a practical man. I deal with facts. Deer tracks in mud, bear scat on trails, the kind of evidence you can measure and photograph. Animals are animals, and people are people. That's how I've always seen it. Until October of 1983, anyway. It started on a Tuesday morning when I got a call from dispatch. 3 hunters had come down from the mountains near Brasstown Bald, scared out of their minds. They claimed something was tracking them, something that knew exactly how to hunt humans. Probably just got spooked by a bear. I told my supervisor, Dave, city folks come up here. They hear one twig snap and think they're being stalked. But Dave shook his head. These weren't city folks, Tobias. These were local boys. Been hunting these mountains their whole lives. Tommy Bradshaw was one of them. That got my attention. Tommy Bradshaw could track a mouse through a thunderstorm. If he was spooked, something real had happened up there. I drove my truck up the winding mountain road to their campsite near the peak. October in the Georgia mountains is beautiful, all reds and golds, crisp air that makes you feel alive. The harvest moon was coming in just a few days, and the whole forest felt electric with that special energy you get in autumn. Their camp was a mess. Gear scattered everywhere, fire put out with dirt instead of water, sleeping bags left behind. These men had run from something and run fast. I started looking for tracks around the camp. That's when I found the first thing that didn't make sense. There were footprints leading away from the camp, human footprints, size 11 boots. But 20 feet out, those same prints changed. The left foot was still a boot print, but the right foot had become a bear paw. Then both feet were bear paws, then wolf tracks, then back to human prints. I stared at those tracks for a long time, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Maybe someone was playing a prank, switching between different fake feet. But the spacing was wrong for that. The stride stayed exactly the same, even as the tracks changed from human to animal. I followed the trail for about 100 yards before it disappeared completely on. A rock outcrop. No more tracks. Nothing. Like whatever had made them had just vanished into thin air. That night, I camped at the same spot where the hunters had been. I've spent more nights alone in these mountains than I can count, and they've never bothered me. But that night felt different. The usual forest sounds were all wrong. I heard a perfect elk call around midnight. Problem was, there aren't any elk in Georgia. Haven't been for over 100 years. Then I heard wolves howling, and we don't have wolves either. Not anymore. But the strangest thing was the silence that came after each call. In a healthy forest, when one animal calls, others respond. Birds rustle, small animals scurry. Something moves. But after each impossible call, the whole mountain went dead silent, like everything in the forest was holding its breath. I kept my rifle close that night and didn't sleep much. The next morning brought more strange reports. A family camping down near Vogel State Park said they'd watched a man walk into the forest at sunset. But in the morning, they found bear tracks leading away from the exact spot where the man had entered the trees. 2 different hunters called in saying they'd heard someone calling their names from deep in the woods, but when they followed the voices, they found nothing but animal tracks. I decided to bring in help. My friend Robert Blackfeather is a Cherokee elder who works as a cultural consultant for the Park Service. If anyone could make sense of what was happening, it would be him. Robert arrived that afternoon in his old pickup truck. He's in his 70s, with long gray hair and eyes that seem to see everything. He listened quietly as I told him about the tracks and the impossible animal calls. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Finally, he spoke. "My grandfather told me about something like this," he said. "A hunter who broke the sacred laws, who killed animals that were not meant to be killed. The spirits cursed him to become what he hunted, but never to be satisfied by the hunt. Robert, come on. You know I respect the old stories, but we're dealing with something real here. He looked at me with those sharp eyes. What makes you think the stories aren't real? That evening, we made camp together, near the spot where I'd found the strange tracks. Robert built the fire in the traditional Cherokee way, with specific prayers for protection. I thought it was just ceremony, but I have to admit it made me feel better. Around 10 o'clock, we heard footsteps approaching through the trees. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that sounded human. I grabbed my flashlight and called out the standard ranger greeting. "This is Ranger Mountain Hawk. Please identify yourself." The footsteps stopped. Then we heard a voice calling back. A perfectly normal human voice with a slight southern accent. "Just passing through, Ranger. Didn't mean to disturb you." "It's pretty late to be hiking, sir. Are you camping nearby?" "Something like that," the voice replied. I stood up and shined my light toward the voice, but I couldn't see anyone. The beam showed only trees and shadows. "Sir, I need to see some identification. Please step into the light." That's when we heard the laugh. It started human, but it changed as we listened. It became deeper, wilder, then it turned into a howl. Then a roar. Then something else entirely, a sound I'd never heard before and never want to hear again. Robert grabbed my arm. "Don't follow it," he whispered. "But I'm a law enforcement officer. When someone doesn't comply with a reasonable request, you investigate." I started walking toward where the voice had come from, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. I found tracks immediately. Human footprints, leading away from our camp. But as I followed them, they changed again. First one foot, then both feet became something else, something with claws. The tracks led me about 50 yards from camp before they stopped at the base of a massive oak tree. I looked up and saw something that made my blood freeze. There was a man sitting on a branch 20 feet above me. At least, it looked like a man at first. He was naked from the waist up, with long dark hair and skin that seemed to glow pale in my flashlight beam. But his eyes reflected the light like an animal's. And when he smiled, his teeth were too sharp and too white. "You should not have followed me, Ranger," he said in that same southern accent. "The hunt is not for you." I reached for my radio to call for backup, but when I looked up again, he was gone. Not climbing down, not jumping to another branch, just gone. I searched that tree for another 10 minutes, but found nothing. When I got back to camp, Robert was packing his gear. "We're leaving," he said. "Tonight." "Robert, what the hell was that thing?" He looked at me with fear in his eyes, and Robert Blackfeather had never been afraid of anything in his life. "That was Joseph Ridgerunner," he said. "He's been hunting these mountains for over 400 years. We packed up camp and hiked back to the parking area by moonlight. Robert wouldn't say much during the hike, but once we reached our vehicles, he told me the whole story. Joseph Ridgerunner had been a Cherokee warrior in the late 1500s, one of the greatest hunters in the tribe's history. But he became obsessed with the hunt. He started killing sacred animals, white deer, albino bears, eagles, during nesting season. The tribal council warned him repeatedly, but he wouldn't stop. Finally, he killed a white wolf on the night of the hunter's moon. According to Cherokee law, white wolves were messengers from the spirit world. Killing one was the ultimate taboo. The medicine men cursed him that very night. They bound his spirit to the hunting grounds and transformed him into what he had become, a creature that could take the shape of any animal he had killed, but would never be satisfied by any hunt. He was doomed to hunt forever, growing hungrier and more desperate with each passing year. For 4 centuries, he stayed hidden, Robert explained, taking deer, bears, smaller animals, but something's changed. He's getting bolder, hunting closer to people. "Why now?" I asked. "The hunter's moon is 3 days away. Every 50 years or so, on the night of the harvest moon, the curse grows stronger. He gets more power, but also more hunger. And sometimes," Robert paused, looking up at the star-filled sky, "sometimes he starts hunting people." I wanted to dismiss it all as folklore, but I couldn't forget those eyes in the tree, the way the tracks had changed, the impossible animal calls. The next day, I got a call that changed everything. A hunter named Mike Patterson had been found dead near Anna Ruby Falls. The body had been torn apart by what looked like Multiple different animals, LNTR, claw marks from a bear, bite marks from a wolf, and puncture wounds that looked like eagle talons. But here's the thing that made no sense. All the wounds were fresh, like they'd happened at the same time. No single animal could have made all those marks. And there were human footprints all around the body, circling it like someone had been dancing. The state police wanted to call it a bear attack, but the medical examiner was baffled. It's like he was attacked by a whole pack of different animals, she told me, but they would never hunt together like that. I knew what had really happened, even if I couldn't put it in my official report. That night, I went back to the mountains alone. I know it was stupid, but I had to see for myself. I parked at the Brasstown Bald Visitor Center and hiked up to the observation tower. From there, you can see for miles in every direction. The harvest moon was rising, huge and orange through the trees. And, in that moonlight, I saw something that will haunt me for the rest of my life. There were animals moving through the forest below me, but they were moving wrong. A bear was walking upright like a man. A deer was stalking through the underbrush like a predator. A hawk was flying in perfect circles, like it was performing some kind of ritual. And in the center of it all, I could see a human figure. Even from a distance, I knew it was him, Joseph Ridgerunner. He was conducting them somehow, directing their movements with gestures. I watched for maybe 20 minutes before he looked up at me. Even from half a mile away, I could see those glowing eyes lock onto mine. He raised one hand and pointed directly at me. That's when all the animals stopped moving and turned to look up at the tower. I ran. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I ran down that mountain faster than I'd ever moved in my life. But I could hear them behind me, the sound of dozens of animals moving through the Biljan forest in perfect coordination, like a supernatural hunting party. I made it to my truck and got out of there, but I knew it wasn't over. Whatever Joseph Ridgerunner had become, he'd marked me as his next target. The real horror was just beginning. I spent the next day researching everything I could find about Joseph Ridgerunner and the Cherokee Curse. The tribal records were scattered, but Robert helped me piece together the truth. The curse wasn't just about punishment, it was about balance. Joseph had upset the natural order by killing sacred animals, so he was transformed into an eternal hunter who could never achieve satisfaction. Every animal he killed just made him hungrier. Every hunt just increased his need to hunt more. But there was more to the story. According to the oldest records, on the night of the hunter's moon that occurs every 50 years, Joseph gains the power to break his curse. But only by claiming a human life in a ritual hunt. If he succeeds, he becomes human again. If he fails, he remains trapped for another 50 years. The last time was 1933, Robert told me. A park ranger named William Crenshaw disappeared that night. They never found his body. And before that, 1883. A Cherokee hunter named Samuel Crow Feather. He knew the stories, tried to perform a counter-ritual. Didn't work. I looked at the calendar. Tomorrow night was the harvest moon. The 50-year cycle was completing, and I was apparently his chosen target. That evening, I drove up to Brasstown Bald one last time. I wasn't running anymore. If this thing wanted a hunt, I'd give him one. But I was going to do it on my terms. I brought everything I could think of. My rifle, silver bullets that Robert had blessed, sage for burning, and an old Cherokee prayer song that Robert had taught me. I also brought something else. The knowledge that I was part Cherokee too. My grandfather's blood gave me the right to challenge the curse directly. As the moon rose full and orange, I built a fire at the highest point of the mountain and waited. He came just after midnight. I heard him before I saw him, footsteps that changed rhythm and weight with each step. Sometimes human, sometimes the heavy padding of a bear, sometimes the light tread of a deer. When he stepped into my firelight, he looked completely human. Tall, muscular, with long dark hair and traditional Cherokee features. He could have been any tribal member, except for his eyes. They shifted color constantly, brown like a man's, then gold like a wolf's, then black like a raven's. "You came back," he said in that familiar southern accent. "I was hoping you would." "Joseph Ridgerunner," I said. "I know who you are. I know what you want." He smiled, and his teeth gleamed white and sharp. "Do you? I've been hunting for 400 years, Tobias Mountain Hawk." I've killed every animal in these mountains 1,000 times over. But I've never killed another, Cherokee. Never tasted the blood of my own people. The curse ends tonight, I told him, one way or another. He laughed, and the sound echoed off the mountain peaks. You think you can fight me, boy? I am every animal that ever lived in these mountains. I am the bear's strength, and the wolf's cunning, and the eagle's vision. As he spoke, his form began to change. His arms lengthened and grew fur. His face stretched into a muzzle filled with fangs. Claws sprouted from his fingertips. But he wasn't becoming just one animal. He was becoming all of them at once. A nightmare fusion of every predator that had ever walked these mountains. I raised my rifle and fired. The blessed silver bullet hit him center mass and he howled in pain, but it only slowed him down. He came at me like a force of nature, moving with impossible speed. I rolled aside and grabbed a burning branch from my fire. Cherokee folklore said that shapeshifters feared fire because it represented the spirit that they had abandoned. The flames made him hesitate, but only for a moment. Then he lunged again, and this time there was nowhere to run. His claws raked across my chest, tearing through my shirt and drawing blood. The pain was incredible, but it also cleared my head. I remembered what Robert had told me about the curse. Joseph wasn't just a monster. He was a man trapped by his own choices. And Cherokee law said that any member of the tribe could offer redemption, even to the cursed. Joseph, I said, backing away from his advance, I offer you the old choice. Return to human form and face judgment by Cherokee law, or remain cursed forever. He stopped mid-attack, his twisted features showing confusion. I am Tobias Mountain Hawk, grandson of Walking Bear, great-grandson of Stans and River. By the blood of our people, I invoke the ancient right of tribal judgment. For a moment, his form wavered between animal and human. I could see the man he had once been, trapped inside the monster he had become. 400 years, he whispered. 400 years of hunting and never being satisfied. I just wanted to be human again. Then choose to be human, I told him. The curse only has power if you keep feeding it. He looked at me with eyes that were fully human for the first time. Then he smiled, a sad, tired smile. I choose, he said. The transformation was immediate and terrible. His animal features melted away like wax, revealing the man beneath. But 4 centuries of unnatural life couldn't be undone easily. As he became fully human, his body began to age rapidly. Decades of time caught up with him in seconds. Within moments, Joseph Ridgerunner was an ancient man, withered and frail. He collapsed beside my fire, but he was smiling. Thank you, he whispered. The hunt is finally over. He died as the first light of dawn touched the mountain peaks. I carried Joseph Ridgerunner's body down the mountain as the sun rose over the Georgia peaks. It felt like carrying feathers. There was almost nothing left of him. Robert was waiting for me at the ranger station, along with several other Cherokee elders. They had known this night would come, had been watching and waiting for 50 years. We buried Joseph, according to Cherokee tradition, in a ceremony that few living people had ever seen. The elders said prayers to release his spirit and restore the balance he had disturbed so long ago. The official report listed the recent deaths as bear attacks. Sometimes the truth is too strange for paperwork. But the real truth is this: the mountains are quiet now, in a way they haven't been for centuries. The animals move naturally again. The forest sounds normal. Whatever dark hunger had been driving the wildlife for generations has finally been satisfied. I still work these mountains, still check hunting licenses and track poachers. But I also watch for other signs. Now, evidence of people who might be pushing too hard against the old laws, taking too much from the land. Because I learned something important that night on Brasstown Bald. The stories our grandfathers told weren't just stories. They were warnings. The natural world has its own justice system, older and more powerful than any human law. And sometimes, when people forget their place in the balance of things, the mountains themselves will remind them. Last month, I found tracks near Vogel State Park that didn't make sense, human footprints that occasionally showed claw marks. A hunter who'd been reported missing turned up 3 days later with no memory of where he'd been, talking about dreams of running on 4 legs. I called Robert immediately. It's starting again, I told him. Different mountain, different hunter, he agreed. but the same old hunger. Some curses, it seems, are older than we thought, and the Appalachian Mountains have a long memory. Keep a bag packed now, ready for the next call. Because somewhere out there, another hunter has probably forgotten the old rules. Another person has decided that their hunger matters more than the sacred balance. And when that happens, the mountains will choose someone to restore what was lost. Last time, it was Joseph Ridgerunner. Next time, it might be me.